Hello and welcome to Game Production Basics. I'm Tobiah Marks.
I'm Amanda Lange.
Let's introduce ourselves. Amanda, tell us yourself.
My name is Amanda Lange. My Twitter is Second Truth, and my website is also secondtruth.com. I'm actually a Microsoft technical evangelist from the Philadelphia, Baltimore area. I live outside of Philly. And in my other life, I'm also a game design teacher. I've been a game design teacher now for about 7 or 8 years. I used to teach at a school called International Academy of Design and Technology. And now I'm teaching at Harrisburg University of Science and Technology, and I teach virtual worlds classes, stuff like that. I am also a game critic. I write for a website called taprepeatedly.com, so games are kind of my life.
Very cool.
And this is Tobiah.
Games are my life as well. I'm Tobiah Marks. I'm a game evangelist at Microsoft. It means I have basically the best job in the world. I get to talk to game developers all day. I actually started this job about a year and a half ago. Before that, I ran my own mobile company for about 4 years making indie games. So indie games have been my entire professional career. You can go to tobiahmarks.com where I have a blog where I write various articles and cool stuff like that. And I also run a podcast called Be Indie Now where I interview various game developers. So this is Game Production Basics. We're kind of going to go over an overview of how to get into the games industry, what kind of roles and jobs there's going to be in the game industry, what tools you need to use. If you want to make games but don't really know how, this is the right place to start. Yeah,
we're going to start with the overview that you're watching now, and then we're going to talk about what kind of software and hardware that you need to get started making games. In the third module, I'm going to talk about game assets, what kind of things you need, what kind of software you need to make art and sound for your games. Mm-hmm. And then the fourth module, we're going to talk about business models.
How to actually make some money making games and how games today make money, because it's different than what it was 10 years ago.
And then finally, we're going to wrap up with a fifth module of just some resources that you can look at to learn more, because today we're really just going to scratch the surface, and there's a ton of information out there that we want you to know about.
Mm-hmm. So again, if you've programmed some games before, you've made a couple games, you released some to the store, this might be more basic for you. We're not designed this talk to explain how to make a game from a technical aspect. We're not going to show you how to use the tools or specific programming. We're just going to talk as a high level about the different roles in the industry, what you need to know, what software you need to look at, resources that you can find. So there's no experience level required in order to use this content.
Yeah, if you're interested in games and you just want to get started learning more, then this is the place for you.
Very cool. Also, this is on Microsoft Virtual Academy, which is a great resource to continue learning. So I recommend checking out some of the other great modules. And for this one in particular, if you're watching live with us, you can use the code GameProdBasics. That's GameProdBasics. And that expires on December 8th. But if you use it till then, you'll get 50 MVA points, which you can use to up your score, redeem some cool things.
And if you decide you really like game design development, there's going to be additional MVAs coming up that are going to explore that. And there's also some MVAs already in Microsoft Virtual Academy that explore that.
And we'll talk more about that in Module 5.
Right.
So, you ready to get started?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started.
Excellent. So, first thing we want to talk about is the state of the game industry right now, what it's like, how it's different than 5-10 years ago, and as we mentioned, the roles of game development, what a designer is, what a programmer is, what a developer is, etc. So
we're going to talk about how the game industry has evolved, not just from historically. The game industry has actually been around for a pretty long time now.
Very long.
But we're going to talk about what's changed over the past 5 or 6 years, just to give you kind of a little basics about how things have evolved and how that matters to you when you get started on your journey making games.
Mm-hmm. I know when you and I started making games, it was very, very different than it is today. So let's rewind. Around when we were graduating school, getting into college, games meant arcade, game consoles, or PC at home. And even the arcades were something that are kind of gone away. You see very few places
Yeah,
have them nowadays.
we went to the arcades all the time in the 90s. I'm not showing my age. And then they kind of started to go the way of the dinosaur around the turn of the century, I guess, is a weird thing to think about.
But now gaming was just your game console that you would spend hundreds of dollars on, and you'd buy $50, $60 games. You play it, that was it. There would only be so many games that would come out per year. Same thing with the PC market. You would buy this one $50 box, play through the game. Again, there were only so many companies were making it. You had to get distribution. You had to physically print the game on a disc, ship that disc to a store. They had to go on a shelf at a store.
Right.
It was only on that store for a certain amount of time. This sounds kind of, silly,
well,
but
there was the old shareware model too, where people would burn physical discs or print out discs, and then they would put them in envelopes and mail them to your house.
I remember that.
That's how a lot of the old games got distributed. They would mail you a physical disc.
I'll show my age. I got a Commander Keen copy on floppy disk.
Right.
I think I had to mail in for that. But again, we're showing our age here, but this sounds so old because everything is digital distribution now.
Right.
Now you can make a game, put it up online, and anyone can download it anywhere in a matter of hours from all over the world. A small developer from a major studio can get content that can be seen by millions of people in mere moments. There's no scarcity anymore. I can download a game from 3 years ago, no problem. I don't have to worry about it, finding it in a bargain bin or tracking it down. It's just so much availability. And not just in the fact that there's this digital distribution on all platforms, but also the mobile and tablet market has exploded. Now you can play games on every device, and everyone has a smartphone nowadays, or at least many people do, and people want to game on it.
And it feels like everybody games more than they used to, too. Just the fact that you can take out your phone and play a quick round of whatever game you're interested in. You can check it out briefly. I was on the airplane. I saw people pulling out their smartphones and playing games on the airplane. Smartphone market is huge, and games make up the majority of paid dollars on apps in the smartphone market.
Vast majority of money made in the tablet market is from games, and it makes sense because people want to play them everywhere, and there's so many more potential players now that anyone can pull out their phone and play a game in between. Even if they're sitting at home, they can sit down on your tablet on your couch and play. Experience might end up being more enjoyable than that traditional game console used to be. Certainly a lot cheaper.
So Tobiah, those games are free though. So are we going to go into how those games actually make money?
Yeah, so the business models have changed a little bit too. It used to just be that premium experience where you pay some money, you get the game, you own it completely, you play through it, that's it. It was a one-time transaction. There was also some free games every now and then where something would be released for free or shareware that was generally designed to have you either buy the game fully later or to buy something else. Like I remember there was a Sneak Keen, I think it was called. It was a Burger King game that they released for free on, I think, the original Xbox.
It was the Xbox.
Yeah, It was a long time ago. But now freemium has kind of taken over as the default standard for making money with games. And when I say freemium, it's a mixture of free and premium. And that's a free game that has the option for you to pay money.
And we'll go into that later in the business.
I'm sure you've played games out there. If you've played many modern games lately, you've seen extra DLC content, in-app purchases to buy more coin, upgrade a weapon. That's exactly what I mean by freemium experiences. But the main thing I want to talk about for what's changed in the industry is the rise of the indie game developer.
Now, there's always been indie game developers. I mean, the people that used to put games in Ziploc bags and mail them to you,
those were small teams. But for suddenly the game industry started getting really, really big, obviously. And those studios became really big companies. You had to have publishers that distributed, had to get your games on the shelves in the store. But now, because of digital distribution, anyone can make a game and get it in front of millions of people. So the indies are not just small-time hobbyists on their way towards a big studio.
No, people can make a lot of money making indie games.
Millions of dollars in many cases.
All the games that you see on your screen or saw on your screen a minute ago were Xbox One games for ID at Xbox.
These aren't just small PC things that people do on the side. These are being released on every major platform. Indies have a huge presence now. And we want to encourage you to go out there and be an indie game developer. Even if you want to work in the AAA games industry, if you want to make these big multi-million-dollar games and be part of a team doing that.
Sometimes it's great for your resume to have a small game under your belt, something that you've published yourself, and you can prove that you can actually release a game and get it published by yourself.
Everyone can be an indie game developer, and it's easier than you might think, especially if you think it's hard, because it's pretty easy.
So let's move on and talk about some of the roles that you need in game development.
Yeah, what kind of positions there are in the game industry, what roles you'll need on a team in order to actually make a game. There's 3 main roles that we're going to talk about. One is the designer, the other is the developer, and the other is the artist.
Now, that isn't to say that those are the only roles in game development. There's a lot of other things that you can do in the game industry. Marketing, you can be a producer. We're just not going to go in as much in depth, because if you're going to start as an indie making your very own title, the 3 things you're definitely going to need are design, art, and development. Those are absolutely must.
Yeah, because if you don't market your game's still going to exist. If you don't have a producer that's managing people and organizing the stuff, if you don't have a designer, you don't know what your game is. If you don't have a developer, your game doesn't exist. It's not coded. If you don't have an artist, then it's not going to have any visuals for people to see or interact with it. So those are the 3 required roles. And again, you can have one person doing all 3 roles. We're not saying that you have to have 3 people in order to make a game, but they're the 3 main categories of what you're going to do. And there's a lot of subcategories that we'll talk about from there.
Right. There's a lot of people that do combination roles. They'll be like a designer developer, maybe a designer artist, and that's totally okay. So think about it as just tasks that need to be accomplished. Might be all one person doing all 3 of those roles. Let's start with talking about the designer. I think there's a lot of confusion as to what a game designer is as opposed to a game developer.
Yeah, what exactly does a designer do?
So a game designer is the person who comes up with all the stuff that's going to be in the game. Now, that seems like, that's the easy, fluffy job, because I can just sort of write random stuff and it ends up in...
Do you mean the story? Because I'm good at coming up with stories.
Well, yeah, partially the story, but not just the story on a high level, but the individual pieces of dialogue said by any character that speaks, if you have dialogue in your game, but also the levels in the game, what the characters are, what their statistics are. I mean, think about...
The core mechanics are themselves. What is the gameplay? You can't just say, this will be a shooter and you run around and shoot things. You have to specifically lay out, okay, what weapons are, how much damage does this weapon do versus another, or how does you interact? What does the UI tell the player at every given moment?
What button do I push to make it shoot? Is it going to be, the same as every other shooter? Am I going to change it up? Do I have some different ideas for weapons? Do I have different ideas for armor?
This is all coming up in the designer's head. They're just inventing it. And it isn't just a game that they're going to play in their head. They have to communicate that to the rest of the team. So the designer's job isn't just to come up with the idea. That's a whole separate minor point. Anyone can come up with a game, but a designer can communicate specifically what a game needs to be so that other people can follow along that designer's vision and create it.
So that brings us to what's the designer's favorite tool to use. And you may be surprised, but definitely the designer's favorite tool is Excel.
Yeah, spreadsheets. Number one thing, I talk to a lot of game designers. I'm a designer myself, and spreadsheets are the most common tool I use because you can block out specific ideas, numbers, patterns. It's just a blank canvas for you to work with. Word as well, any kind of text-based document. But some people kind of think a designer is more of I sit down and come up with the ideas and then I get to play the game role. And it ends up being more of a number crunching, spreadsheet, writing type role. Good English skills, good writing are very important.
You do a lot of math when you're a game designer, and you have to figure out, a lot of times you're throwing fuzzy math at the wall just to see what sticks. You lay it down in a document, you maybe pass it off to your developer, or you do that development, and then it ends up in the game and you can test. So that spreadsheet, that Excel sheet is really, really useful, and it's nice. It's a nice thing to have.
Now let's talk about an artist for a moment. And again, when we say artist, we're being vague again, because there's a lot of different kinds of art. I don't just mean a traditional painter painting on oil canvas here. We talk about 2D art, we're talking about 3D art. That could encompass the rigging, the texturing. Those are things we'll talk about more in Module 3. But we also mean musicians, people who do the sound. Really just the assets that you're experiencing when you play the game, what you see, what you hear. You need an artist to create those sensory stimuli.
And also includes the UI too, doing any kind of layout for what the menus in the game are going to look like. That's an important job. So in this, we're encompassing a lot of things under this idea of an artist.
And generally artists, especially in a larger company, wouldn't do multiple one-C tasks. They would hyper-focus to one specific task. If you're an indie, you'll probably have one person jumping to a lot of different roles. And so it depends a lot on your project, what's needed. Obviously, a 2D game doesn't need a 3D artist or any of those roles there. Some games do require music, some games don't, or at least they have music already done. So you don't necessarily have to have all of those sub-roles, but it depends on what you're using exactly.
In a big game, the art department is a huge part of the game development process. They may hire 100 artists to work on a game because they have to do very specific things when they're working. They may have to there may be one person whose job it is just to animate attacks, and that's all they do. Or there might be one person whose job it is just to do the sound effects for a particular character. And they'll be very specific and focused. So that tends to be a big part of the process.
So speaking of specifics, they all have very specific tools
Right.
that they use for specific jobs. So there is a whole suite of different tools you can use as an artist. And what we have listed here is just a small sampling of what's available, but it's what Amanda and I personally use or what we personally like and recommend.
I'm going to go into some of the tools in Module 3 and show you some actual previews, but these are just some screenshots of me at work, when I'm showing the 2D process. I'm using Photoshop in the top there. And
Photoshop is my favorite 2D editing tool. It's the industry standard. A lot of people use it, but of course it costs some money because Adobe wants to make money with their great tool. But there are free alternatives. GIMP is an open source project. It does most of what Photoshop does. Maybe not as nice of interface, to be honest, but definitely a great tool, and it's free, so there's no reason not to download it and check it out. And we also have a web program called Pixlr, Pixlr, that you can use in a web browser, so you don't even need to install it on your computer. And all of these edit 2D images. And there's also tools that you can edit vector images, but again, we'll talk about this between raster and vector in Module 3.
And in the end, what art tool you use tends to be your personal preference. If you find a tool that really works for you and you really like the workflow, then that's probably what you're just going to gravitate toward. And it also depends, of course, on the needs of your game.
What kind of 3D tools are there for 3D editing?
So there's Maya, there's 3D Studio Max, which is what I use the most. And I also like this program called ZBrush. That's really cool. You can actually get a piece of digital clay and mold it, and it's used a lot in higher end games like Gears of War, for example. So let's move on to talk about the development process. What's the developer do?
Yeah, the developer takes all these different pieces. You have the designer's ideas, you have the artist's assets. The developer is the person who programs the computer to actually make it come together, to make the game come alive, to make it a game and not something passive like a movie. They give the computer instructions through coding to actually make that button do something. How does it press? How does the computer know where you need to be? How does the computer know which asset to show at which time? So we didn't just call this person a programmer because programming is kind of specific. I mean, there's some game engines that you don't even need to use programming in order to create a game. But the developer is a more encompassing term that basically means the same thing for someone who, as I said, makes the game come alive.
And you called out AI on that slide. Is that one of the biggest challenges?
Yeah, AI is probably one of the most difficult things you can do as a developer because it's so specific. Now, when I say AI, you're generally not creating an artificial intelligence that is running background in a computer. Now, if I have a shooter game as an example, and there's an enemy soldier running at me and shooting, that soldier is not an AI by any stretch of the imagination. It's usually given very, very specific tasks, like run forward until I see a player, then shoot that player, then when I don't see a player, run forward again. Sometimes it's even dumber than that. It doesn't even know what forward is. It just goes from various waypoints that the designer laid out in the level. Just go from waypoint A to B to C until you see a player or you're told within X distance from a player. And figuring out how to make an AI seem smarter than it actually is. Because no AI is smart, but how to trick the player into making them seem smart is the trick of development. I've heard it been said that the trick of programming is not to make something good, but to trick people into thinking that it's good. Trick people that it looks like there's more going on to this world. It looks like that this character is making an actual choice when really they were just behind the scenes rolling a random number.
And this is where the designer and the developer can really work together. They can be a team, and sometimes it's one person who does both, but the designer says, hey, I really want this character to behave in this way, and the developer comes up with the logic to actually promote that process. So there could be a lot of back and forth between those two roles, but they're not exactly the same role, because the developer has to actually execute on these designs, and the designer is the person who comes up with what exactly is going to do. And sometimes
it's a really good point.
Drawing flowcharts.
We want to emphasize the difference between a designer and a developer, because they're two distinct different roles. And again, one person can be both. I'm often both when I make my own games, but they are, there's a big difference between coming up with an idea and then actually implementing it. Because if you're just implementing it and you have no idea what direction you're going in, you're just making random characters running around, you're making buttons do things, and you might find that your game doesn't necessarily have the fun or isn't as good as if you thought it out. If you thought, okay, well, how is this going to be fun? How am I going to enhance this experience? How am I going to make my player interested in what's going on? That's all questions that the designer is responsible for answering.
And when we talk about development methodologies, we'll talk about playtesting, which is another crucial factor.
Absolutely,
so
absolutely.
So let's talk about, briefly, just the tools that a developer would use to create games.
Well, the number one tool that we've talked to many, many different developers, and it's Visual Studio. It's Microsoft's tool for coding. It's an IDE, or Integrated Development Environment, where you can write many different kinds of languages, compile the programs, and run whatever you want. It even integrates into other game engines. We'll talk about what a game engine is in the next module. You see here in the screenshot, this is actually Visual Studio running code for the Unity engine. Right. And it allows you to write out this code if you haven't done code before, it's these text commands that list out exactly what the computer needs to do.
And sometimes game engines have different coding environments, either already pre-installed. Like, for example, we'll look at GameMaker, and it kind of has its own little coding environment. You don't necessarily need to have a complex IDE to write code. It just really helps.
Yeah, you can actually make games in Notepad if you want. I wouldn't recommend it because there's a lot of advantages to using something that's designed for code. It has a spell check for code, if you will, in a lot of these engines, and also really great formatting, debugging, analyzing. There's a lot of reasons why you want to use that, but different tools you might switch between different programs. So again, it depends entirely on what engine you're using and what you need.
Well, we're going to look at some of those engines, I think, in the next module.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to talk about exactly what you need to get started. But for now, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. So we'll see you in the next module.
Welcome back to Game Production Basics. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Tobiah. Just before, in case anyone was wondering.
Yeah, we talked about this. We didn't mention it last module, but we both had the same hair color.
Yeah, it's total coincidence, by the way. It's very funny. We both did it like a week or two ago. And hey, now we both have purple hair. So
It's magenta. That's what my stylist said.
Close enough. Well, you ready to talk about what you actually need to make a game?
Yeah, let's talk about that. We're going to go into all the stuff that you need, or at least some of the stuff that you need to make a game. And this is going to be an overview of this module. We're going to talk about hardware. We're going to talk about software.
So the physical devices you need, what software you need on those devices. And then we'll talk more about the forming of a business, how you actually create a company that's going to make games. That's more centric towards indie game developers. But again, we want to encourage everyone to be an indie game developer.
And I'm also going to talk, we're going to talk a little bit about the size of the project, or what we call scope, how much manpower and time that it takes to create games of certain sizes. And going along with that, we'll talk about how to organize your first team. If you want to make an indie game on your own, you might need more than one person to help out. So
yeah, it's always nice to work with other people.
The ways to find people to make a game with you and how to get that team started. So the first thing we're going to talk about is hardware.
What actual devices that you need. So do I need a supercomputer in order to make games?
Nah, you don't really need a supercomputer. You may already have a computer that works just fine for the process of game making. It's possible that you've got something in your pocket that you can...
There's even tools like Touch Develop that are entirely online. So if you're able to view this video right now, you probably have a system that's powerful enough to do some kind of development.
The biggest question, first of all, is what platform are you targeting? Are you trying to make a game for the touch screen platform? Then you probably want a touch screen to test on. You're going to want something that matches what your game output is going to go to.
Yeah, if you're making for consoles, you obviously need at least one copy of that console. If you're making, for Xbox specifically, you'll need an Xbox.
And if you are targeting the Xbox, we have a program called ID at Xbox. It helps to have your game kind of ready to go, and then check that out. Just, open up your Bing search engine and look for ID at Xbox. You'll find out more about our Indies program for Xbox. Don't forget about the smartphone, too. Smartphone, huge market right now. You can target all the phone platforms, or you can target just one or two phone platforms.
Yeah, and it's really easy with our smartphone platform because pretty much any smartphone will work as a development device. You simply flip a switch into settings and you can start developing on it. And if you want to make, say, for Windows Phone, you don't just want to get one Windows Phone. If you have only one, that works, and that will get you most of the way there for testing. But if you were in a professional studio environment, you would have as many different types of that device as you can get, because there's going to be subtle differences between them. Some are going to have more RAM, maybe the screen's a little bit bigger, and there's a technical aspect, again, like different RAM, different processor power to make sure the game runs smoothly, but also just the physical aspect of it. If you have a very small device, the gameplay might be different, or the text might read too small, and so you need to see it on that device to really understand that, okay, actually, I designed this for a 1520, a very large screen, and when I shrink it down for a 520, it doesn't look as good, so I need to make sure the font size is increased for that specific platform.
So, any game development, we recommend that you have a keyboard to type on. You're going to probably be writing some code. There is a touchdevelop.com where you can code without typing, which is pretty cool. But
there are some drag and drop tools, but bottom line is you'll probably want a good keyboard to type on. If you're using one of those touch type keyboards that don't really have a key response, it's harder to develop on. You can do it, but it's harder.
And you're going to want the internet just to get on to get tutorials and access to different things that you're going to help you reference and reference
images. You can develop online. You can download those stocks ahead of time, but it really helps if you have internet connection, because you could, say, listen to us talking while you're developing a game, or listen to other tutorials, or look at other websites. So having that reference is really, really important.
And that point where you're going to need that higher end computer with a good graphics card is if you're doing 3D development. Any game that takes a higher end computer to run is obviously going to take an even nicer computer to develop. It's going to be crunching a lot of numbers, a lot of polygons, which I'll show you in a later module. And because of that, at that point, you're going to want a higher end computer. Now, that's just
not everyone's going to have a high end graphics in their game. In fact, if you're a small two-person team, especially if you haven't done development before, we would kind of steer you away from trying to make next gen level graphics, because that takes a lot of people and a lot of work, as we're going to talk about. So don't worry about it too much if you don't have a high-end system. If you can make a game that runs well on your system, whatever that specs happens to be.
We also recommend, if you're doing 3D or if you're going to work in Unity, for example, you want a 3-button mouse. You're going to get a lot of use out of that mouse wheel. It's just a really good
Yeah, very common problem I find if people trying Unity for the first time and they don't have a 3-button mouse. And it's not an explicit requirement, pass it all over the website, but it is going to help you out a lot in order to navigate around in a 3-dimensional space on a 2D monitor.
So speaking of Unity, that's software, right? So we're going to go into software next.
Yeah, exactly.
And talk a little bit about what kind of game software that there is. So
you actually run something on those machines.
Yeah, game software falls into a couple different categories. There's the actual game engines, which is what the game is sort of created in. And then there's the IDE, which is like your Visual Studio, your development environment.
And all sorts of other tools in between.
And all kinds of other specialized tools that we're going to look at, too. And we'll just give you a couple examples. We're scratching the surface of what's available out there.
Yeah. So first one we're going to talk about is the IDE, or Integrated Development Environment. As I mentioned in the last module, it's what you're actually going to write your code in, and we recommend Visual Studio. It's a very advanced tool. It does all sorts of different things, and there's a free version out there, Visual Studio Express, that will serve most of your needs. There are some advanced features that you don't get. They're in the Professional and Ultimate SKUs. But if you're an indie developer, that is a small developer is making a brand new company that is less than 5 years old, makes less than $1 million a year in revenue, and the primary purpose of the company is to make software, you can get through a program called BizSpark, ultimate subscription to MSDN, which will get you Visual Studio, the Ultimate Edition, for free.
And that's a really, really good value. It gives you a lot of software that you need. You can also get hosting on Azure.
Yeah, we give a lot of really great software through that program. And it lets you use the best of the best tools that are available to make your game, for commercial purposes, everything that you need. You can be in the program for up to 3 years. It's a really, really great system.
Now, if you're a student, you can also get Visual Studio through the DreamSpark program, and that's just at dreamspark.com.
Yeah,
so if you happen to be...
If your school participates in DreamSpark, go on to dreamspark.com and see if you qualify and verify your email address, and you get a learning edition for free that you can play with and learn how to mess around with things. And again, you can use anything to code in. You know, if you wanted a free tool, there's Visual Studio Express, which is a lighter version of Visual Studio for free. And there's a host of other software out there that you can use to code on. So definitely try out multiple things. A lot of these tools are free or have free versions, so there's no reason not to try stuff out.
Speaking of other tools, we may want to talk a little bit about art creation, asset creation.
We're going to go over these a little more in depth in Module 3, but we wanted to touch on the different types of software there is. We mentioned it last time where Photoshop is one of my favorite tools. I use it all the time. And GIMP, we also mentioned that. And there's also Illustrator and Inkscape. And those are similar to Photoshop and GIMP, where Illustrator is a tool made by Adobe. It's the industry standard. It's what a lot of people use, but it costs money. Inkscape is an open source free alternative that you can check out that has all similar features. But the question I have for you, Amanda, is what's the difference between the two tools? What's the difference between a raster image and a vector image?
Oh, okay, so Photoshop creates what's called a raster image most of the time. There's a pen tool in Photoshop, but Photoshop is specialized for pixel images, which is to say that it's a specific resolution, it's a specific size, and it's going to come out that size no matter what.
So most of the time we think of images, we do think of these pixels. Like I'll have a 100 by 100 image, and that pixel's red, and that one's blue, and that one's red, and you pull back, and that forms a image of some kind you're going to see on the screen. But not everything operates like that on a computer. There is something else called vector.
With a vector image, it's basically independent of the resolution. So what a lot of artists will do is they'll use Illustrator. It creates points in space. The computer calculates a curve between those points. And then no matter how much you zoom in or out, it'll remain the same resolution, which is useful if you have different displays you're targeting. Say you want to make a high-res version for the console and a lower res version of that same asset for a phone, you can use that same drawing and just resize it.
Yeah, it's much more convenient instead of having to make a big version, a small version, say make a change in the small version, now I got to make a change in the big version. They're not really compatible with each other going back and forth. And you don't want to take a small image and enlarge it to be bigger because you're going to see these big blocky pixels and it's not going to look nice. But a vector image can then be exported into a raster image, a pixel-based one, on any resolution you want, 1,000 by 1,000, 100 by 100, whatever you choose it to be. So it makes it much more convenient for certain kinds of games to be able to do all your images in vector first and then export it out.
On the other hand, sometimes I kind of like that 3D, that pixel retro look.
Yeah, there's all sorts of reasons why you want to stick with pixels. Sometimes this is unnecessary. You don't really need to go through the step. If you're not used to working in vectors, again, you probably want to work with what you're used to. And Photoshop does do a little bit of vector-based stuff. It has some vector tools in it, even though it makes raster images. But again, we don't want to confuse people too much.
Another thing to point out,
do what you know.
When I get into texturing, texturing is resolution dependent, regardless. So you have to know what size your texture map is. And that kind of brings us to talking a little bit about 3D. I'm going to talk more about 3D in Module 3, but there's some different tools that people use. The most commonly used free tool is Blender. I'm a big fan of 3ds Max and of Maya, which those are both Autodesk's properties. If you happen to be a student, there's an educational license version that you can get for free. Otherwise,
I would recommend
they
checking
run
them
a little
out because
pricey.
a lot of companies are Maya or Max houses. That's most of what they use. Blender's getting more and more popular because free is a big deal. 3D software is unfortunately not cheap. But it's really great that there's open source free tools that you can use to just edit a few assets if you need it, try stuff out. And most of these have, even if you don't have an educational discount, you can get a 30-day trial of some kind or some way that you can mess around with it and learn if this is the software for you before you have to invest in it.
We do have some examples of game engine software that's free or that have free versions.
Yeah, let's talk about game engines as a concept for a moment first. What exactly is a game engine?
So a game engine is sort of a package that has partially game physics and game assets for you to try out. So you don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel. It's got the basics of a game underneath it. And you can add your own spin on whatever's installed in the engine. Is that a good way of explaining it?
You don't have to code everything from scratch. If you're making the graphics, I don't have to worry about the shaders and the rendering and work for months in code just to be able to display a moving image on the screen or have a complete physics simulation or even something as practical as just having GUI text on the screen or buttons. A lot of these engines do a lot of the basics they need for you. They don't make your game for you, but they give you the tool set in order to make your game much, much more easily. You can just with a couple clicks include very common themes. They structure the code in such a way that it's very easy to understand. In some cases, like Game Maker, you can even do drag and drop coding, where you never actually need to type a line of code in order to make a full completed game. Unity in particular is amazing because it's a 3D engine, and 3D gets really, really complicated from a programming perspective if you were to implement it yourself. And so having that all done for you is amazing. And even more amazing, all of these tools have free versions, free forever, not just trial. And then they all have premium features that you need to pay for to get. But for just starting out in game development, the free versions are completely fine.
Yeah.
Everything that you need.
And the free version of Unity is pretty robust. It's got a lot of really good features. I mean, if you're looking at Pro, there's a couple things that it adds, but they're totally not necessary to get started.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about Unity because it's kind of our favorite engine. We use it a lot. And there are other really great engines out there too that I use. We don't want to, give the wrong impression, but there's different engines for different jobs. As it says, if you're making a 3D game, Unity is the one you want to use, except no substitutes. But there are, if you have a 2D game, there's a lot of different choices. Again, we're going to show 3 different ones that have very different feels, very different types of games they make, different code bases that they use. So you should download them all, try them out, find what works for you, find what makes your game that you're developing the easiest to implement, goes to the platforms that you want to do, all that stuff.
And if something else appeals to you, these aren't the only tools out there. So look around, see what's in it. And we're going to show some resources in our last module that might lead you to a different solution. So just think of this as a starting point. Let's go ahead and demo some of those engines just to get an idea of what they do.
Yeah,
right?
just to show off what I mean by a game engine in particular. So right here on my screen, I have opened Unity. And this might look a little complicated at first. There's a lot going on, so I'm going to try to explain a little bit of the different aspects going on. So on the left side over here, I have on the top here, this is my scene view. This is me editing the 3D world of what I'm going to see. And then down here below it is my game preview. And that is what the game actually is going to be when I'm playing it.
Yeah, I love those beautiful lights. Like, I love that I can see the little light bulbs and see what color they are. It's so cool.
So if I just hit play right now, you can see that down here in this bottom view, I start moving around. In fact, I can stop playing, hit maximize, and now when I play, it will maximize this game view.
Oh, very cool.
And I can see that I have this little 3D stealth game.
This demo is kind of new to me. I love this game. This is neat.
So I'm sneaking around. I can move really slowly. I have a sneak animation playing. And if I run around the corner, and I'm going to be a very bad stealther right here, and going to get these robots to chase me.
Now, you got this demo for free, right?
Yeah, this was a completed project. All of these assets, all of the code is available for free on Unity's website. And they released this just to show you how Unity works, and so you can mess around with it, play with it, and learn from it.
Can I see how that soldier is put inside the game?
Yeah, so let's look over here in our scene view. So if I zoom in over here, move that real quick. I can see that the soldier is here, and if I can rotate around and zoom in, here he is in 3D space. Now, those lines that you see are actually showing the vertices of those 3D models. And we'll explain what that means when we talk about 3D in a moment. But they're basically the different points in space that this character is. And I can move him around with this little gizmo over here, and I can switch to a different type of gizmo, and I can rotate him.
That gizmo is the technical term, by the way.
Yes, it is actually called a gizmo. Funny enough, nerds make game engines, so they name it funny things. And if I look over here, I have him selected right now. And over here on the far right is my inspector. And you can see that I have a bunch of different properties for this character. I have the name over here. I have his X, Y, Z position in space. So that is
geometry pays off.
Oh, yep, exactly. There is definitely some math involved in game development. And then if I scroll down over here, I have things like rigid body. And that's exactly what we were talking about before. With just adding this rigid body module, which is just right-click add, I all of a sudden have physics in this game. I don't have to code a physics engine. I don't have to worry about weight. I can just say, okay, this has a mass. I have angular drag, gravity. Don't need to worry about those stats right now.
And that's where using a pre-built 3D game engine really comes.
This will save hundreds of hours of work.
You would have to code your own physics engine, and that is a big project. Really big project, yeah.
Now you might be asking, where's the code in all this? Well, if I scroll down further, I have multiple scripts attached to this character. So if I look at its movement, I can just double click that, and it automatically opens up for me in Visual Studio. It doesn't by default use Visual Studio, but if you have Visual Studio Professional or Ultimate, and again, you can get that for free through BizSpark, you can get a plugin called the Visual Studio Tools for Unity.
Yeah, Unity VS.
It's great. It lets you use Visual Studio with Unity, integrates completely. You can use breakpoints, debugging, get that all done. We show more details too in the developing 2D and 3D games for Unity Microsoft Virtual Academy. You can check out later.
Yeah, there's a whole MVA going into much more detail. So if you're interested in seeing some of this stuff in action in more depth with plugins and Windows-specific features.
And all these tools are going to show we have either an MVA coming out about it or is already out there that you can check to learn. But you see the functions here. So I have on awake, which is when the player, the character is first loaded in the scene. It'll run this code. I can scroll down to here, and I have different functions for when it moves and rotates. In Visual Studio, I have this little tree view right here that has a hierarchy of all the different scripts that are in my game. So I can open done enemy shooting.cs, and I have all of that code for the enemy attacking, and this is some basic AI code that, again, Unity has as an example for you. So it's a really great way to learn is seeing what people have made.
The nice thing about that is you can actually look at this code, see exactly how to pull it apart and figure out how it works. And it's just one of the easiest ways to learn to make something is seeing what other people have made and building on it. So that's there for you.
Exactly. All of these engines have really good samples. So speaking of other engines, let's show off GameMaker next.
Okay.
GameMaker is a very different style than Unity. For one, it makes 2D games. It doesn't do 3D. But it's also designed to be more easy to use if you've never done coding before. And you can already see the interface is a little bit simpler than Unity. There's a lot less buttons going on. And there's really only one panel here, and we have a list of all the different things that are part of your project. We have the sprites, sound files, background files, a couple scripts, and objects that are things that are going to exist in my player's world.
A cool thing about GameMaker is that I've taught it to kids, and they pick it up pretty fast because it's actually easy enough to learn at first that it's not too difficult learning curve. But at the same time, people have made really great games with GameMaker.
Oh yeah, there are a lot of really good games made in GameMaker for sure.
So if you have any curiosity about that, the website is yoyogames.com. And they have a gallery that you can look at that shows some of the games that are made in GameMaker. It might surprise you just how good some of those games end up looking.
So let me show you opening up an object here, why GameMaker is so easy. I've opened up my player object right here, and I've said, all right, I'm going to have a sprite right here. That's of my player sprite. And then I have a series of events. So on create, it runs when the object is created on the screen. I have an event for when the left key is pressed and the right key or the left and right mouse button. And GameMaker works in this event-based system. So whenever this action happens, it runs the code that is over here. This doesn't look like code because it's actually drag and drop modules. I can have it where I take a jump command right here and I drag it and drop into there, and I can say go to 50 pixel, or let's see, 50 by 50, press OK. And now the first thing it's going to do on create is jump to that exact XY coordinate in the screen. Drag and drop, simple as that.
So what if that seems like a lot of extra work, though?
Well, some people, if you're more advanced in code, you want to do more advanced things, you want to actually write some code. Well, you can do that. You can drag and drop down to the control here, a code module, which I've already done in this project right here. And I can write some very simple code to define some variables. Okay, I have an array here, I set some values, and it was easier for me to type this up in code than do drag and drop, but it integrates seamlessly with the drag and drop. I can also do a script like I have over here that I might want to run on multiple objects, so I can reuse code. I don't have to do the same code over and over again. And I have this script that's run by multiple things, and I can pass arguments into it. And
you've got your sprites up there in the corner of the art as well.
Yep, exactly. I got my sprites. I can open that up right quick, and these are all some raster sprites. GameMaker also has a really good sprite editor, actually. If you wanted to draw on a sprite within the program, this is actually a pretty good tool, especially for pixel art. I know a lot of professional artists actually use GameMaker's editing, even if they're not actually making their game in the GameMaker.
Yeah, I've seen some games that just do all the animation directly in GameMaker. It's pretty cool.
So now if I want to run this game, I just press the green play arrow up here in the corner. And I press that, and you'll see down here in the bottom, I have the compile text going on, where it's showing the game rendering, making it, doing the code. It'll take a moment to pop up. This is actually an endless runner game that I made as an example. You can get on my blog or on my GitHub page and download the source code for this so you can play around with it. But again, this isn't the only tutorial out there. There are tons of completed GameMaker projects out there for you to play with, learn from. And here it is run it, opened up in a small window. And now I have a little gem game. I'm not sure if I have sound effects going on right now, but there's sound effects in this example too. But I'm running around playing, collecting some games. And again, this seems pretty simple, pretty basic game, but it took me only a couple hours in order to make this.
Yeah,
so,
if you get used to GameMaker, you can make stuff pretty fast, and it's good for prototyping. You've got an idea, you can get it out there really quickly and just give it a shot.
Yeah, if you challenge me to remake this, now that I have all the assets created and I've done the code before, I could probably remake this example in just a few minutes, actually.
Well, it starts to go pretty fast.
Oh yeah, the game speeds up over time, so we'll quit out of that. But that's GameMaker for you. The next tool we want to show you is Construct 2. This one's more similar to GameMaker in the way it's structured. You have a scene environment right here, and you drag various sprites in, and you look. Here's a commonality between all these engines. It has what you have in the screen, a little hierarchy right here. I have the different layouts, which is different areas you have in the game. The event sheets, which is kind of the code for the game. And then the objects are your sprites and sounds.
Yeah, it seems like pretty much all these game engines show you that little folder structure. And Visual Studio shows you that folder structure as well.
Exactly.
So you can see all the different things you're plugging in.
So I could click this player sprite, and then I have all of these properties over here. I can, define what the name is. I can give it different variables, like this one has a health value because that's the player that's want to live. And I can go over to the event sheet right here, and you can see that the code is also kind of drag and drop similar.
Wow.
I can zoom in here for the touch, and it says, all right, on touch, is it touching? Then do this code to move the player to this coordinates so that you can see that it's a touch-based game. And what's also cool about Construct 2 is that it makes an HTML game. So you can play in your browser, or you can make a Windows 8 app, a Windows Phone app, lots of different platforms. All of these engines actually are all cross-platform and support all of the major platforms.
So if you fire that up, it's going to run on the web?
Yeah, see, it opens up a copy of Internet Explorer. And now I'm playing this cool little shooter game. I didn't even have to install this template. This came by default when I installed Construct 2. It's got these cool effects. You see there's little explosions happen when my guy hits it. If I purposely die or get hit, you can see my health gets reduced. I can do pickups. All sorts of cool stuff.
And this is at sura.com is the website, right? We'll put that up again.
We'll have all the links too in the notes too. Or if you need those links, feel free to ask in chat. We'll be happy to share them with you.
Cool.
So yeah, those are the three engines I wanted to show you. Again, just give you a basic overview of what engines are available, what you can use, what you'll be able to jump in and try. There's a lot more out there, a lot we never showed off.
So can I make money off these free downloaded engines that I just downloaded? Can I?
Absolutely.
You want to talk about money?
Yeah, let's talk about, like, with money comes a business. And I know some of you out there, you're not chomping at the bit to go make your own business, but I want to encourage you that you should start thinking about it, start doing it. If you want to be an indie developer and you want to make these games full time, think about that business structure, that legal structure. Think about who you're getting involved in your company, making contracts, getting it out on paper, and there's going to be a lot of advantages for doing so we're going to talk about. But this advice is going to be very, very, very general because I don't know the specific laws of your area.
Yeah, you might be in a different country.
I live
come
in
from all
San
over.
Jose, California, right. And Mountain View, California, a few miles away, has different laws for starting your own business. I'm going to speak a lot for American companies because I'm American. That's personally what I know. I don't mean to be exclusive. It's just the different countries, different counties, different cities will have different legal structures.
So you mentioned three types of businesses here. What are the differences between these types of businesses?
Yeah, in America, there's sole proprietorships and partnerships. Those are usually really simple constructs. Again, this is not legal advice. This is just my personal experience sharing with it as a starting point for your own research. A sole proprietorship is someone that it's a company that is you. You are your own company. From a legal standpoint, you can create it fairly easily. Partnership is just a document that you sign with someone else that says, hey, we're starting a company, we're going to work together for this percentage. There's something more advanced of a corporation. I'm sure you've heard of a corporation before. It's where you create a separate legal entity. In American law, it's basically its own person.
It doesn't have to be huge. You don't have to be huge to be a
No,
corporation.
you can have a single person corporation. And there's also something smaller in between, like a limited liability company or limited liability partnership that gives you that limited liability. That means that you aren't your company. So if you were to sue me for some reason, you would only sue the company's assets versus my personal assets. But again, I don't want to dive too much into this. That's a subject for some other book that you can read, some legal advice. I'm not a lawyer.
Why would I want to go through all this process, though?
It's generally it's simpler than you think. I know it sounds complicated, but a day or two of research, maybe consulting a lawyer, you get out this paper and you get a lot of advantages for doing so. First off, just defining the ownership. Say, Amanda, you and I want to start a company. Sure. We want to work together. Let's say you and I work on a game. It's great. We get most of the way there, and then we both get busy and we abandon it and don't do anything else. But
it happens all the time with
all the time in projects.
There's a lot of unfinished indie games out there.
But then 3 years later, I want to actually continue working on the game. So I polish it up. I work on it for another 2 years, make this amazing game out of it, and then release it. Who owns it? Who owns what percentage? What percentage of the profits do you get versus I get?
But if we created a company, then that entity is what owns the idea behind the game.
That defines it out ahead of time.
And everything.
You might be working with a friend or even just by yourself with a contractor, and you might think, oh, it's really clear. We're working together. We don't need to worry about this. We're not fighting. But you never know what's going to happen down the line. You never know what disagreement you're going to have. And until you get things down in paper, there could be lots of disagreements. There could be a problem. You could end up having trouble, and just getting it down, hey, I own this project, I own the IP or intellectual property of this, and then you're working with me, or we share it 50-50 and it would protect you just as much me.
You've probably heard the term IP before. That means intellectual property. It's basically the concepts and characters and stories that go into that game. And you can't make a game with someone else's IP unless you're on a contract from that company or something like that. So, I mean, we get questions like, hey, can I make the next BioShock game? Well, you don't own that IP, so no.
Yeah, no, I don't have the right to make the next Halo game.
Right.
I would have to make my own game. I can make a game very similar to Halo, but I couldn't call it Halo, have Master Chief, make it look just like a Halo game because I don't own the rights to that.
Not personally. That's owned by the company that owns it. So that's what these companies hold on to that IP.
Besides those legal protections, there's also a lot of tax benefits for owning a company. This is a tip that I like to share with a lot of people. I've owned my own game company for a while. That means that every game I've ever bought, every game console I've ever bought since I started my company is a tax write-off. Now, you may or may not worry about that right now, but trust me, it's really nice if you can write that extra few $100,000 off every year of every game that you buy as a tax write-off for your game, because it's research material. Every game you're buying is something you're going to study from then on and learn from it and analyze it and compare it. And we're going to talk about that more in Module 5 on how to look at a game like a designer and how to not just play games, but to learn from them.
And if you're looking to get a job in a bigger company, having a company name on your resume is always a nice bonus. Yeah, that means that you've done your homework and you know how to do that and you've got that title. And it makes for a good, especially if you have a game that's released. A lot of times if people are looking to hire from a company, they're looking for how many titles have you shipped.
From then on, you can say you are an entrepreneur. No matter what happens, even if the company fails and you never make any money with it, you have industry experience as an entrepreneur. And that is really, really great resume material. In a lot of cases, looks better than even schooling. Just saying that, hey, I actually had the initiative to start my own company. I learned this paperwork. It shows to an employer that you're ambitious. It shows to an employer that you're willing to learn and try new things and put yourself into risky situations, which in a good way, be able to try out new ideas.
If you've shipped and published games, put that on your resume. I mean, it's great. It's a great resume. A lot of people only want to put their education or their jobs that they've worked for someone else. But if you run your own company, it's great resume fodder.
Yeah, being an indie isn't just an ends to itself, although it can be a dream job if
Absolutely.
you can get enough for full-time income
and
with it.
some people quit big industry and move into indies, too. That's
Exactly. But it is a great way to get into the industry by just using it as an
you can go
education.
either way.
Use it as a graduate school, your own graduate school.
So we have another thing to talk about, which is scope and size of your project.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about in the generalities of making a game, but exactly what kind of game you make does vary greatly. Are you going to be making the next Minecraft? Are you going to be making the next Halo? Well, if you're going to make that advanced 3D Halo game with hundreds of levels and full multiplayer modes, that's going to take a lot of work. Halo was not made by 3 people.
No, about 200 people is the number that I have.
200 people for over a year.
4. Yeah. For Halo 4, it took a long time and a lot of people. An interesting thing is a lot of people know that the story of Minecraft was started out with just one person. They have a company now that
Notch, one person, created Minecraft all by himself, released the game. Then it got popular, and now Mojang, the company that runs it, he hired a whole team of people that still work on it today.
The important thing I think to talk about is what's the difference? How come it only takes one person to get started on Minecraft and it takes hundreds and hundreds of people to get started on something like Halo?
Well, I mean, Minecraft, you look at it, it has very simple art, very simple game design, and the idea is it's focusing on one core mechanic. It's focused on one idea, building a world. Whereas Halo, there's all sorts of different systems. If you just try to reverse engineer Halo, what's going on? You have all of those 3D models, all of those animations, all of the details. This gun does exactly this much damage. The AI programming of how the enemies behave, where they go out, the pre-scripted events, the story integrated, the sound recording.
Voice acting?
Oh, yeah. It takes hundreds of hours to put all those things together. So you might have a game that you love. Say you want to recreate Final Fantasy. Well, recreating that whole...
project.
Yeah, that could take you years. It takes a whole team of hundreds of people years to make it. As one person, it might be unrealistic for you to remake it from scratch. But if you just take one aspect of that game, you're saying, okay, I want to simulate a boss fight. That is pretty narrow. You just have the characters, the boss, some mechanics, some abilities. If you don't have leveling up systems and all the different tiers and classes, you just focus on just the core basics of what made that part of that game unique. You can work on that mechanic at first and then iterate on that, expand upon that. And there's really no way for us to tell you, okay, this game will take you that much time. Because all of the biggest games out there, all the biggest $1 million successes were ambitious projects. It was very ambitious for Notch to make Minecraft by himself. No question about that. But
a lot of the things I see people get discouraged about when they're first getting started is that their idea is really big and they don't realize it. And I think part of that just comes from the practice of making a couple smaller games to understand how to create games and then saying, oh, okay, now I get how much work goes into this. Because a lot of times someone will hand me a design document that's incredibly ambitious in scope and they don't think it is because they don't realize just how many people it takes to make games like that.
And it's okay to not know. Don't be embarrassed by not knowing. But that's just a great opportunity to learn. If you have an unknown, just say, all right, well, I need to try this out. I'm going to take a weekend and try to get as far as I can implementing this idea. Oh, wait, I've realized that I now need to do these hundreds of things. It's going to take me months. But you don't know until you start. And that's why we want to encourage think small, think simple, focus on that core idea of what makes your game unique. Don't worry about adding all of the extra bells and whistles at first. You can add them later. You can iterate on them. But start off as simple as you can.
If you have, say, an RPG idea, and maybe it's very focused on the story, maybe it doesn't also need those really lush 3D graphics. Maybe you could do it with more simple retro graphics and a lot of text and still make the game that you wanted to make. A lot of people want everything. They want the fancy 3D graphics. They want all the story. And actually creating levels, like blocking them out and laying them out and then filling them with art, takes an enormous amount of time. So one of the things that makes Minecraft leaner to develop is that it's procedurally generated.
The procedural means that the computer is generated. So Notch didn't hand lay out all those Minecraft worlds. It's randomly generated every time you play. You have a vast, sprawling world full of interesting things that is generated by a computer algorithm, by a formula, a mathematical formula.
And the game that Minecraft is now is not the game that it was when it launched in alpha. And alpha was much simpler, and that's when more people started to kind of come onto the project.
Excellent point. A lot of indie games are kind of play tested in public and developed in public. So when you start playing a game, it didn't look like that before. It's been constantly updated, constantly iterated on. They started off small, they started off simple, and as it grew in popularity, they added more content to it, added more of those bells and whistles once they knew the core game was fun.
So how would I go from being a one-person company to having a team? What's the process there? Can you talk about the team organization?
There's a lot going on when actually forming a team, and a lot of different ways you can structure it. And some people use just a traditional waterfall method. That's what a lot of AAA studios do. That's where you have, at the top of the ladder, you have, okay, I'm going to design out the game, figure out what's going to be, and then below that, after that's done, you start implementing the art assets, start creating the basic engine, then you implement the actual testing, figure it out if it works, and then you ship it. So it's a waterfall method because it flows in one direction. It's very linear. But with the rise of indies...
I like the agile method. That's fun. Yeah. So an agile development process is kind of like a bunch of little loops.
A bunch of small little waterfalls.
You release what's called a minimum viable product, or the MVP, and it's maybe a slice of what the overall game is going to be. You can even, they have early access or open alphas now where you can download these games that people are still working on and play them, or you can play test internally with just that little slice. You can ask your friends and family to play, maybe go out and offer people free pizza and say, hey, I've made this game, you try? If you watch 5 people play a rough draft of your game, you will learn so much. You can take it back, do another iteration, polish, perfect, fix some of the bugs and some of the issues that you didn't see, take that version that you have, play test with 5 more people.
Yeah, it's so much better to get a product out there as soon as possible. Get something as playable as soon as possible. And so we recommend those more agile methods. Now, agile is a very encompassing term, Scrum, all these different ways that you can do that. And if you're having a larger team, you might have a more formal process. If you're doing 1 or 2 man development, you might be a little more loose with it. You might just have a shared Word document or shared Excel file that you're both working off of.
Right, and documentation becomes more important the bigger your team is, and so does the idea of version control.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the real thing we want to emphasize when you're doing a team, that you need some kind of version control. If you haven't heard of that before, basically that means that we have a shared code base between everyone on the team. So say Amanda and I are working on a project together, and I'm doing the programming and she's doing some of the programming and all of the art, because I'm not as good as art as she is. I'll work on the code, I'll make my changes, and I submit them to a separate repository somewhere floating on the internet. And then on her computer, on her machine, wherever she may happen to be, downloads that, pulls it down, and then has all the latest code for her to play with. She adds new assets, she does a little bit more code, submits them up, I can download it, integrate her code into mine. Now suddenly we were both on the same page. We didn't have to copy files onto a thumb drive and put it on a zip file and go back and forth.
That just gets really messy.
Yeah, we didn't have any confusion of, wait, was this the latest version or is that the latest version? It's all automatic, it's all in the background, it's really, really useful. And even better, say I'm working on it and I make a mistake that just breaks the game, it's terrible, or maybe I just implement a feature that ends up not being fun or it's not good.
And I could just revert back to the previous version and say, hey, let's just go back to where you were before and start again from there and delete those new changes. And we don't have to remember, oh, what change was it that you made that made it break?
Especially if it was a change that I did 3 versions ago. Having to reverse engineer what you did and remember that can get very complicated, especially when you have a larger project. There's a lot of code in that project, so it can get pretty tricky to have to remember exactly what's in it and what's not.
So we like GitHub. That's a good version.
It's a great place you can host. It's free. You can for open source projects. There's also, if you're a student, you can get private repositories for free. Also, if you're a BizSpark member, you get Visual Studio Online for free. But it also lets you host either Git or TFS, or Team Foundation servers. Forgot which one it is. But TFS is a great way to host as well. There's a lot of different protocols out there. There's also Mercurial, SVN. These all are just acronyms out there. Personally, I like using Git. But whatever version control works for you and your team, that's up to you. We just recommend that you use something, get it out there, save it. It's going to save your hindquarters when something bad happens.
And in a later module, we're going to talk a little bit about where team members come from, and that's going to be
how to
in
find
module
them, how to get them.
4. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. In the next module, I'm going to talk about art assets and different tools that game artists and sound designers might use to create stuff for the game. So we
actually create those very pretty looking things.
We want to stay tuned for that coming up.
All right, we'll be back. We have a 10-minute break. Hello and welcome back to Game Production Basics. This is Module 3, Game Assets, where we're going to teach you how to actually make things that the users can experience and see in their game.
I'm excited about this one. It's going to be fun.
It's going to be a lot of demos. So as an overview, what we're going to talk about, we're going to say what is an asset in the first place. We're talking about 3D assets, 3-dimensionals, all that, what goes involved in there. 2-dimensional assets, sound asset creation, and where you can actually find or buy assets if you don't want to make it yourself. A lot of it we're going to be talking about is how to make it yourself, but there's ways to get it if you don't want to be the one that actually makes it.
A part of this, too, is just your basic breakdown of what these things are. A lot of times people don't have any concept of what the 3D model looks like when it's not in the game. So I'm just going to sort of show you a brief overview and give you some information to help you understand what you're looking at when you look at that in a game.
So let's start with that question, actually. So what do I mean by an asset exactly? We talked about it in previous modules, but when I say art asset, what does that mean?
An art asset is any one unit or chunk of art that happens to be in the game. A piece of art could be anything from a texture on a wall to a texture on a character to the actual physical model of the character that makes up that character object. It could be a button that you see in the UI. It could be a sound effect that you hear playing. It could be music that you hear playing. It could be a blade of grass that you see in the ground. All those things are considered game assets. And a lot of games have tons and tons of assets. I mean, you have to think
thousands of assets.
You have to think every time you see a mailbox or a dumpster or a piece of graffiti in a game, there's somebody that had to deliberately make that.
Made that by hand. I mean, there's ways to get it, or do motion capture for animation and all that. But we're going to be talking about how to sculpt it in the computer by hand, which is how most assets are created.
Yeah, animation's an asset too. That's a really good point. Voice clips are also an asset. So a lot of times you need the help of actors to create that stuff. So there's a lot that goes into creating game assets.
So let's talk about the most complex asset first, 3D assets. That's 3-dimensional. Now, we don't really have 3D screens. We have 2D monitors.
No, we're not talking like a hologram that floats above the screen. No. What we're talking about is an asset in a game that is a 3D game. So if you have a 3D
I don't have to put on glasses so to see this.
Right. If you have a 3D game, it's a world that you can walk around and it exists on all sides of you. And the character models and the object models and anything that you interact with in that game also has to exist in 3D space. I mean, it has to be created in a 3D program that basically models the entire object.
You're only looking at it through a 2-dimensional view, but the computer thinks of it as in a 3-dimensional world.
Right.
All right, so let's talk about what goes into a 3D asset. What is a polygon? I've heard that talked about a lot in assets, but can you define what that means?
Okay, well, to break it down in a little more basic terms, first of all, there's this thing called a vertex. The plural is vertices.
So what is a vertex?
A vertex is like a mathematical dot in space. That mathematical dot is defined by a coordinate position, like an x, y, z coordinate, which is your x, y, and your z. And
sounds a lot like trigonometry to me.
It's totally trigonometry and geometry. All this stuff is pretty much what goes into creating this stuff in the first place. And if you take 3 vertices and you connect them with 3 lines, you have a triangle, which is also called a tri for short. And then if you can continue to connect, and that can make up a polygon. So a polygon, which poly is used for short, could be as small as a triangle, or a lot of times there'll be a quad, which is a 4-sided poly, and then that comprised of 2 triangles. So if you have 2 triangles, there's like a line between. It's 4 verts, and it's
4 vertices.
Yes.
So I have 4 points in space, and the computer connects them, and it knows that they are a solid object, so that when you're looking at it on one side, you see the whatever texture, the surface of that polygon is being displayed. However, you rotate those 4 plus points in space.
Another interesting thing about those assets, by the way, is that they usually are only visible from one side, because of the inside, a lot of times they're hollow.
Interesting. So you have to make sure to have polygons on both the outside and the inside of your object if you have an inside.
If you want to be able to go like inside of a house, for example, and you want the outside and the inside, you have to have polygons on both sides.
That explains in some games that if you see an error where you go inside a house that you're not actually supposed to go inside, and you can see out of it, no problem.
Right,
that's because
no
the person who made that asset didn't bother actually modeling the inside of that house, so you only see it one way.
So a lot of times, have you ever seen mistakes where you walk off the edge of the earth and things you can suddenly see through the ground below? It's because they didn't bother creating an underground, because that's not necessary. So that's just one of those weird, quirky things.
Makes sense.
And that's just the polygons. We're also talking about textures. A texture is like a painting that you create in a 2D art program that wraps around that model that you've created. And kind of gives it form and depth. So what's showing on your screen right now is a model I made for it's a rocket launcher for like a tower defense simulation. And that particular model has a 3D aspect that you can see, and you can see that it looks a lot more detailed on the left-hand side.
Yeah, it doesn't really look that great on the right. What exactly are we seeing on the right over there?
What I've done is created a higher poly version of the same model. Use a process called baking to take the higher poly version of the model with all the little details and create a texture map out of those details that then gets put on the lower poly version of the model. That means the game engines can kind of run the lower poly version, but get all the benefits of the texture that adds a lot more detail and depth to the model.
That makes sense. So you can see in that model on the right, you have all those different points of space. Whenever those yellow lines meet, that creates a vertice. And then the gray lines in between are the polygons that form this 3-dimensional object in space that, yes, you said you render it out, you bake it, it automatically makes it a little more smooth, adds the shadows. And so what you actually see and how it's defined in the computer are different.
So go ahead and forward on to the next one there. That's actually what it looks like really flattened out. So that's all.
Wait. How is this the same thing we just saw? This doesn't look anything like it.
Well, right. What you have to do is you have to go into the 3D model. You have to actually cut it up bit by bit, and then you lay it out on what's called a UV map.
So imagine if it were made in physical space and you physically cut it out, if it was made out of cloth and laid it out on the ground, this is what those pieces of cloth would look like.
And the next step, which you don't see in the slides, but the next step is I would actually go back to that texture that was taken out and add color. So then you would add the different colors and highlights and everything that you would do to finalize.
So this flat image is just a raster image that you would go open up in Photoshop or GIMP of your tool of choice and be able to fill it in with whatever colors you want, whatever pattern, whatever logos, inside those green squares.
Right.
And then when you put it into the 3D model software, it'll show the actual character or gun or whatever it happens to be with all of the extra images.
Then you take that painting that you just did, you put it back in your 3D package or back in your game engine, and a lot of times the game engine has a tool as well, and you can connect it up to create different levels of texturing.
So what kinds of textures are there? Is it just the one texture and that's it?
Actually, no. Actually, texturing comprised of different materials. Because in the real world, stuff is made of different stuff, right? Your cloth has a different feel and a different weight and a different way that it absorbs and reflects light compared to something hard surface, something like this mouse is plastic. A metal surface has a different way of looking, or something that's very rough or bumpy.
Yeah, you can tell how something's going to feel just by looking at it. And your brain's trained to understand these subtle differences in the way light is reflected off of it. But we don't have any of those advantages in the computer. We have to simulate every aspect. So we have to explicitly tell the computer, this is how hard it is. This is how much reflected light comes off of this surface and why. This is how much it bends in space.
So there's this process called normal mapping that takes the points in space and tricks the eye into seeing them as being raised and rough and textured. And what you can do a lot of times is create a very textural, complex model, bake that out as a texture, and then lay that as a bump map over top of a simpler model. And there's also the material specular highlighting, and that word specularity refers to the shininess and the shininess factor. And there's also
how much light is reflected off.
How much light is reflected off of that object. And that makes a huge difference in what it appears to be made out of. Think about like a rock. If a rock is if it's dry, it reflects like a little bit of shine, but if it's wet, it reflects a big white points of light, and it's shinier. If you think about metal, it has to reflect back a much more detailed, crisp reflection, and all that has to be taken into account. That's why you don't see like a lot of mirrors in games, why it's a little tricky, because a lot of times it has to reflect the character, and it's difficult, so that's a whole process they have to create.
So how do you link all of these different textures together to form this material concept that the computer can understand?
Well, it gets a little complicated, but basically there's these nodes that you could actually plug in a game engine. This is what you're looking at here is how it looks in Studio Max, which I'm about to show you in the demo. But that we'll actually get to that in the demo, and I'll show you the material breakdown. In other game engines, it's got this nodes setup. In Unity, for example, you pretty much just take your texture files and you create a material with that file, and you put the material on an object in 3D space.
Okay, so you linked it all up. The computer understands, all right, I have just this image of the colors, just this image that's black and white. It just highlights where white is. It reflects white, and where black is, it doesn't. All these different types of normal maps with different colors, with different meanings. You link them all up in the computer, and that forms the 3D images that you see in modern games.
Let's look at a 3D model live. I've got one on my screen.
Let's start demoing it.
It's a real simple one. Yeah, it's a real simple one. Just to show you how that's going to work. This is 3D.
Oh, cute little bear.
Okay, so the reason I picked it, I used to do this demo with a rabbit, and then my students would say, oh, why are you picking on a rabbit? So Tobiah's like, well, pick on a bear, because maybe bears are a little more vicious, get away with it. But then my bear ended up cute and chubby.
So what do you mean by pick on? What are we going to do?
Well, I want to show you how the 3D model gets into a 2D texture. And it's the process is actually called, there's a tool called the pelt mapper.
Well, first off, explain to me what I'm looking at here. I see 4 different bears on this screen. Why is that?
Well, this is the kind of the default view for Studio Max, and it gives me the top, front, and left side of my object, as well as a perspective version, so I can see how it's coming together. When you're actually modeling something, you're mostly going to try and use these views. They're called the orthographic views. That helps you to sort of see what you're actually making, because something might look great from the side but weird from the top, and I may have to adjust. In fact, these legs are a little funny. I probably would continue to work on this if I was gonna, actually
looking just in perspective. Eyes can play the tricks.
Yeah, it can really mess with you. So, but you can actually look at the way it's coming together here. So maybe I wanted to go in here and pull some things apart. Now, I want to draw your attention to this stack up on the corner here. This shows some of the processes that I've done in this modeling. So if I'm actually working on this, I may want to unfold some of these and play a little bit with this. This is considered an editable poly. It's going to warn me, but I know what I'm doing. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this button here. Now, take a look at the little statistics thing right here. I'm going to circle that for you.
This what do those numbers mean?
Tells me how many polys. Remember when I talked about what a poly was? It tells me how many polys actually make this model up. Right now, it's quite a few. It's 2,000. I'll show you why in a second. And the try count is about double Because remember when I said a poly, if it's a quad, is 2 triangles?
So a polygon, which is a quad generally, is basically 2 triangles put together.
And I'm gonna erase.
Right? So why don't I just work in triangles? Why do I deal with polys at all?
Just kind of depends on the game engine. Some engines are going to count tries, and some engines are going to count polys. People use the term poly count all the time, and sometimes poly count means try count. So just sort of, use whatever your engine recommends. This is a mesh smooth process that I've got up here in the corner here. You can see this little process here. I'm actually going to turn that off, and you're going to see that poly count drop. So this is the actual polys that I modeled.
It looks like the bear just gained some weight.
Yeah, well, he's not as smooth out now. The mesh smooth kind of tends to shrink things a little bit. It's almost like shrink wrapping.
So kind of like those vertex-based art we were talking about before, where you have these points in space, and it was smoothing the curve between point A and point B. And when you turn that off, it's just putting straight lines between. That makes the bear look a lot more bulky, maybe more like a game from the 90s rather than the 2000s.
And to be honest, I might put this bulky bear in the game engine, but what I would do is create a texture that gave it the appearance of the softer.
Oh, I see.
So it's a little bit of way
that way the computer doesn't have to render as many polygons, which means that you can render more 3D objects and not have to worry about processing power. To be able to calculate all the different polygons, but yet it still looks good.
Yep. You see that I can drill down here and actually look at the individual vertices or vertex in vertex mode. And when I'm in vertex mode, I can make these little micro adjustments that'll help the model come out alive. So when I'm making these little pulls, then the ear is kind of in a weird place. I don't know. I'm just going to pull it to the side a little bit. And it should allow me to quickly view that. And then when I'm going to go back to the top of my stack, and it's going to be back where it was. So that adjustment hopefully won't affect anything in my unwrap, which is another process that you actually add.
So unwrapping is when you're taking that 3D model, and much like that turret we saw earlier, flattening it out. So that's why we're talking about the bear, because it's kind of like when you see a bearskin rug. You see a bear flat out on the ground, and you can imagine folding that bearskin rug back up, and it creates the 3D object. And that's how you have to work with 3D in these 2D analogies.
Now here I'm selecting individual polygons, and you can actually see that I've got the bear already. I'm going to actually reopen him because of that little adjustment that I made. It's going to take me just a couple seconds.
All right, so what you're doing is you're automatically using the tools to automatically unwrap everything for you.
Right. I just didn't want to lose any of the work that I did previously. If you click on this version here, do you see those blue lines? Those blue lines are essentially slices that I made to tell the engine, or how to tell Studio Max how to unwrap the bear. And I wanted to be sure to cut deep enough that I would flatten it out into a rug.
So if you imagine that this bear was made out of cloth and exists in space, that was where I put a knife and cut it out in order to take the skin off the bear.
Yeah, I know, isn't that amazingly gross? But that's the reason I use a bear, because it's such a
no bears are being harmed.
No actual bears are being harmed. So what I'm going to do is click on this right here in the corner that says expand my selection to seam, and I'm going to click on that. I'm going to expand. It's going to grab all of that red. That means it's grabbed. I took the liberty of cutting the paws off earlier just so they wouldn't get in the way of the unwrap process. So.
All right.
And then I have this little button here that says peel pelt. Is that cool?
Yeah.
So I'm going to click on that.
Make up the pelt of that bear.
And what it does is it literally is going to stretch it out to create a flat bear rug.
Oh, interesting. So that's very pretty looking. But this is the same polygons that we see on the bear, just opened up?
Yeah, it's going to actually open it flat up like that. And maybe this isn't perfect. I probably would want to go in and tweak it to be sure that all of these were sort of the same size, so nothing ended up squished on my final texture. But it just shows you how you can go from this three-dimensional object to getting a flat object in just a few seconds, really. And then I'm going to rotate that.
Now you could put a fur image into that 2D texture, and you line up the fur so that it's all moving the same way and flowing the same way that you want it to on the bear.
Right, and these are the paws that I cut off earlier. So if I shrink these down, they maybe don't need to be huge on the screen. I can actually move over here into this screen, select that paw, and it's going to...
I can see the selection appear right there in real time.
You can see the selection appear right over here, so I can just grab it and set it aside, so that's one bare foot.
That's very useful to understand which piece is what.
Right, it shows you which piece. So if I look at the bear over here, this little button, again, it's this one right there, and then, and So this program can be a little bit intimidating for beginners.
Yeah, there's a lot of buttons that you're pressing here.
Eventually you kind of start to learn. I mean, look at there's a whole lot going on here, but you can start to learn, and practice makes perfect. And
this is what we were talking about, where 3D games are really hard if you've never done 3D before. You absolutely can learn it and do it, and there's free software available for you to do it, but it does take a lot more work to make something in 3 dimensions than it does in 2 dimensions.
Another thing I want to point out, too, is the lights in this scene. If I deselect the bear, you can see that I've put some lights out. That'll allow me to get a more accurate view of what the character's going to look like in the game engine if I add some additional lights. So I always throw in my own lights. If I click on this button, which is a render button up here in the corner.
A little teapot right there?
Yeah, the teapot. That's the universal symbol for rendering. And then it'll render out what that bear is actually going to look like. So
very cool.
Here it is in perspective, so you can see the 3D. and
then it doesn't have the fur texture on it yet.
No texture.
You can see how it automatically adds a little bit of that shadow.
Yeah, the lights are going to add that shadow just because they're in the scene. And you can even use those lights to sort of help you to understand how to paint your texture.
Very cool.
Yep.
So we're ready to talk about 2D now?
So we talked about texturing, so we're going to talk a little bit about 2D. 2D assets are a different way of looking at the world.
They're much, much more simpler. If that looked too complicated for you, definitely don't worry. You can start off in 2D and a lot easier. So what goes into a 2D asset versus 3D?
Well, there's a lot of different things that you can think about with a 2D assets. You might be making sprites for a 2D game, and a sprite is just like the flat panel of any object, whether it's a character or an item.
Does sprite mean it's like very pixely and very blocky?
It doesn't necessarily have to be. It can be any size. We were talking earlier in a previous module about how you can create something in, say, Illustrator, create a very high resolution image, and you can make HD sprites. I like the retro look, so I do work a lot in pixels, but you don't necessarily have to work in pixels. One of the things that is common to both texturing and spriting is that you sometimes have to use special sizes to make sure that the game engine recognizes that. And those sizes are typically your powers of 2. So it's 16 or 32 or 64 and so on and so on and so on.
So why does the computer have to deal with those powers of 2 numbers?
It's easier for the computer to understand that because of binary. Basically,
computers are binary.
Right. Basically, the hex. So and you can see here a sprite sheet that I made.
so what does this mean exactly? We talk about sprite sheets. I see on the right, I see a animated character walking, and then I see a bunch of versions of that character. What are these? What am I looking at?
If you're animating a sprite, you have to draw individual frames. So this is a really, really simple, goofy little walk cycle with a 4-frame walk, which is like a very simple, small character. This character is only tiny on the screen when you actually see it. But you can make very complicated, larger sprites with larger walk cycles, and then you'll have also more frames of animation.
So you lay out this sprite sheet, which is just one image. It has all these versions of the character, but you don't see all of them at once. It displays one frame or just one individual version of that character at a time, and again, playing those frames in motion as Walt Disney discovered, maybe actually didn't discover it, but as he made popular, you could have the simulation of movement.
And you may have heard that term frames per second before. Most games run in something like 60 FPS. That's how many frames are being flashed in front of your eye.
60 frames? Does that mean I have to make 60 images per second of animation?
Well, it depends on what you're making. If you want to make a game that looks cute and retro like that, you can see the individual frames in that animation. But if you want a really smooth HD animation, then yeah, you're going to be doing a lot of drawing. And of course, 3D, a lot of times with the 3D models, it does some of the animation for you, or motion capture is used to get that animation. So it really depends on your process. There's a lot of different ways that you can create it. 30 FPS is also an okay speed, and sometimes you can do like a shot on twos type of thing where it's showing the same frame the same picture for 2 frames each time. That's another common method to you don't have to draw quite as many frames. But yeah, it can be a lot of drawing, or maybe it isn't a lot of drawing, just depending on what kind of game that you decide you're making. Yeah,
so let's talk about tile maps, where you have not animated characters, but static images, but all on one image file that is then referenced by the computer and pulled apart and displayed out to the screen.
So tiling textures, the biggest thing to think about is that with tiling textures is that they have to be seamless when they line up. And this is true in 2D and 3D. You have to paint wall textures so that you don't see the seam. And I'm sure that you have played a game and seen the seam, because sometimes people not always do as good of a job of this, and you can actually kind of see the edges of some of these things.
So when I see this walkway over there and have all those gray tiles, it isn't that I had 10 plus gray tile images loaded. There's just the one image in that gray tile sheet.
With the gray tile, you can see that I deliberately drew edges to kind of give it that floor feel.
Yeah, it gets that
but then
feel.
with the walls, I did my best to make it kind of as seamless as possible, so it just sort of feels like a white brick wall.
Yeah, that wall on the right side looks like it's one piece, but it's actually just composed of those 3 gray pieces.
Yeah, you can see how it's chunked up, and then with the stone and the wood, for example, you can even see how the different wood panels all locked together. They have the same edges, and that's just a consideration you have to make when you're painting the tiles for a 2D game. And 2D different games have different tile sizes as well, so you aren't necessarily limited to square tiles. Some games use bigger, chunkier tiles, but you just have to think about how are these things locking together, because generally speaking, I have seen games where the level is all one big painting. That is something that you can do. Again, it really just depends on your process.
Just very time inefficient, though. If you have to paint out every little detail of every level, you kind of want to make some commonality. So if you've played a game, even 3D games, you'll notice that there's some repeating patterns going on. The grass is a similar texture in multiple areas. You enter a building, and it's the same floor plan as another building somewhere else in the game. And that's just the developers saving time. Instead of having to create an individual, unique building for every single one that you enter, they standardize it as much as possible and repeat so that you can create a whole world of content without, getting well out of your scope of what your game can actually make.
Yeah, and I use Photoshop to do most of the stuff. That's just my primary tool. What I'm using right now, why
don't we demo the tools that you can have to actually make some of these 2D assets?
Sure, that sounds good. And you can also use this for your textures for your 3D assets as well.
Everything 2D, with all the same tools.
All the same tools. I use Photoshop 95% of the time for all this stuff.
But it doesn't look like you're in Photoshop right now. What is this we're looking at?
This actually isn't Photoshop. This is actually Adobe Pixlr.
Pixlr. Pixlr.
Pixlr it's relatively new, and it's a free online tool that has a lot of the same tools as Photoshop.
But it runs in your web browser. That's really convenient.
Right. I think it's running an Adobe Flash version of Photoshop, essentially, that allows you to actually open files up. This is that same Ninja that you saw earlier, and I've noticed when I was opening him earlier that my final version has this filled in, but this one has like a weird. I forgot to fill his foot in, and it looks a little weird. So if I just go into this pencil here, and I can take one of these and kind of fix up that little weird problem that's happening.
So you're drawing the pixels on there. It's really small. It might be hard for you to see.
It's really, really small, because if you see that this is going to be really like a really small brush, I actually like the paintbrush better in Pixlr, because you get a little bit of a brick showing you what you're actually painting.
What's the difference between a pencil and a paintbrush when you're talking about these 2D softwares?
You just get 2 different kind of line qualities with them.
A pencil tool is the colloquial term for something that's very hard. Either that pixel's being drawn or it's not. But a paintbrush has a softer edge, so you get a little bit of opacity in the pixels around the edge. That means it's somewhat translucent.
I'm about
for what's
to make
underneath
things complicated, though, because look, there's this thing up here that says brush hard tip. Oops, I just lost it. Whoa.
Yes, and in the brush control, you can control a brush to make it 100% hardness, which means that it won't have any opacity, so it works similar to a pencil tool then.
And
I
think the brush hard tip is the best spriting tool in Pixlr. So that's what I've been using. I've been using that brush with the hard tip, and you can see I can just kind of fill that in. Notice that my background here is transparent.
Yeah, what's with those checkered boxes?
The checkered boxes just show that it's a transparent sprite. This is saved out as a PNG, which is my preferred format for spriting.
PNG file.
A PNG file,
yep.
Yeah. A lot of times people are like, well, should I save it as a JPEG or as a GIF? Generally speaking, I almost use PNG almost all the time now.
PNG tends to be very common for video games because it has a really good transparency that you can usually compress it pretty well, so it's a decent trade-off of size. JPEGs usually have some problems because they're a compressed image format, and if you're taking a picture off your camera. That's fine if you have a little bit of artifacting, it's called, a little bit of rough around the edges.
But if it's something like a sprite like this that has to be clean, you're going to start to see those messy artifacts, and it's going to make it look sloppy.
Especially if it's in a tiling texture, because you're going to see that same mistake repeated over and over and over again on the screen. So you want to make sure that you're saved in a format that is not lossy or lossless, which means that you're not losing any of the detail as you save.
Yeah, so that's that tiling texture that I showed earlier there, showing the individual tiles, and you can kind of see a little bit of seam, so it's possible that I would want to go in and clean that up. But the only way to know that is to kind of lay them side by side, get a feel for how they're going to actually look in the game engine, and I make a little pixel by pixel adjustments. Now, you can create new images in Pixlr. A lot of people ask, what resolution should I make stuff at? Like if you're in Photoshop, it'll ask resolution. All that matters is the pixel size if you're making pixel sprites. It doesn't really matter what resolution. All you have to look at is how big is it. So 64 by 64 is going to be kind of a small sprite, and you can see there that's going to be a little bit tiny.
But you can display it larger than that. You can display a 64 by 64 image on, a 256 by 256 area, but you'll just see the blocks in a larger space. But that's actually a very common style, that retro look of that older, blockier pixels.
And don't do what I just did and forget to click transparent, because if you see this white, that's not going to have a transparent background. You really want to have that
don't draw on the white.
Right, you really want to have that checkerboard. That checkerboard is going to be your transparent sprite. So I could just go in here and draw whatever kind of little monster I want. I've been into ghosts lately because right now it's about that time, close to Halloween. Drawing little sprites, and then I can just change the color and fill in. Oh, careful. Don't want to fill in that white, right?
Yeah.
So I would want to be sure to get that line totally sealed to fill in the white. Fortunately, Pixlr also has undo function.
Undo is always handy. Remember to save often, especially when working with something in the web, because you never know when your internet connection might go down. And
yeah, one of the things that you do have to be careful with if you're using this particular program is be sure that you save often. You can save it right to your Facebook. You can save it to your computer, which is what I've been doing. Go with that PNG type of file.
PNG format. That it preserves the transparency.
TIFF is good for textures, by the way, if you're really into that's a pretty large, though.
Yeah, TIFF is usually uncompressed, so it's less lossy, but much larger file size, which is why most game developers that I've seen lately use PNG files.
So if you want to make a larger HD sprite, I opened up an image earlier that I was playing with. This is like a sketch that I did on a Surface Pro. And I just little characters.
Very cool.
It's actually one of my friend's character designs, but I thought she would make a really fun game sprite. And when I'm posing a character for a more HD game sprite, a couple of considerations that I want to think about. I did my best to kind of isolate the weapon. She's got a gun out. The gun shoots flowers, by the way, because I'm all about girly. I'm all about girly characters in games.
It's a little more friendly.
Right. Yeah. Well, it still damages evil. And I wanted to isolate that because I feel like that way, if she changes weapons later, I can just cut this sprite up into individual pieces instead of having it be one gigantic piece. Now, there's lots of sprites HD sprites out there. A game like Skullgirls, they redraw every frame every time, which takes a lot of time up. But you can take your drawing and sort of carve individual pieces out of it. And if you see that when I went another way and edited this, I actually moved that gun back just a touch so that I can isolate this as well if I wanted to.
I see.
So fun little ideas like that, right?
That way you could have different legs if you wanted to, say, have her wear a different pair of pants, or if she gets some type of pants upgrade.
Or if I just wanted to animate the legs moving and not have to worry about redrawing the body over and over again, or if I wanted to animate the head, the hair is short, so it's isolated from the rest of it.
So a lot of game assets are all about being very modular so that you don't need to do so much work. You can kind of recycle as much as possible.
And the more you recycle, the better off you would be. Now, of course, I have a transparent background here, a little bit sketchy on the edges, so the next step that I would do is just go in here and refine that edge to make sure it's nice and crisp. It has to stand out from the background that it's in front of. So that's one of the reasons that I use bright colors. I like pink, pink hair, pink all that stuff. So
yeah, but if the background was pink, then it
would clash, right? So I would want to be sure that the character pops in front of whatever background. And that's the same reason that, like for this particular image, you can see that I'm using white and gray because I had colorful characters. They're going to stand out in front of that background. A lot of mistakes people make is they make everything colorful. And if you don't have some stuff that stands out more than other stuff, you won't be able to tell what's important in your screen.
Yeah, but you have a really fancy looking tree, but it doesn't really do anything in your game. players' attention is going to be drawn to it, and you don't want that. You don't want needless attention to be paid to something that you don't want players to care about.
Yep. So lots of color theory stuff to think about when you're designing game assets.
Very cool.
Yep.
So let's talk about sound assets now, being a musician and actually making audio for your game. Do I need to learn how to play guitar or something or to do this?
You know what? People act like music is mysterious. People act like art is mysterious. Like music is a little bit more mysterious for me, but there's so many different things out there that you can just play around. There's chiptunes editors on the internet that you can make crazy music with. So many different ways that you can do this stuff that you don't have to be a genius. You just have to sort of start playing and see what you can come up with. So we're going to talk a little bit later about where you can get assets. You can find them on the internet, but I'm going to just show you that I downloaded a sound from Freesound earlier. Freesound.org is one of the places where, hey, I maybe want to grab a couple of easy sound effects.
A lot of people recorded sound effects ahead of time, and they're willing to share it with other people.
Sure, and you can make your own music with the stuff that you find online too. Or if you happen to be a musician and you've got a MIDI keyboard, you can totally write your own music. Always you can do that.
Great. I know game developers who, he was a kid who knew how to play trumpet, and so he recorded the entire soundtrack with him just playing the trumpet, recording into his PC speakers. It was hilarious.
That's super cool. I remember back there was like a Making of Mist DVD or CD-ROM that came. It wasn't even a DVD back then. That came with the game, and they showed them taking a plunger to their toilet and recording the bubble sounds that you hear in the game. Like, you can get really creative.
I believe that's called Foley, right?
Right.
It's used in the movies
Right.
too, where you make those sound effects for people's footsteps, running, wood hitting various objects. There's these little sounds that kind of enhance the experience. They aren't necessarily realistic to what you'd find in a real life situation, but they're what people expect when they see something on a screen to kind of add weight to an impact.
So I went ahead and downloaded this sound effect. It's a Creative Commons sound with attribution. So I want to thank Nebulous Flint for being the guy that I took his little 8-bit sounds, and I'm using this program called Audacity. I like Audacity because it's also free. So you can download Audacity for free, and it allows you to basically edit whatever sound effects you happen to be working with.
What's that squiggly line mean exactly?
Okay, so the squiggly line is a visualization of the sound. When you see this big burst, it's loud, and when you see that it's quiet, it's like little small bursts. And when I hit play, you're going to hear some bleeps and bloops.
So every time it's a loud sound, the bars go up. And there's two of them because it's in stereo. So you have a left and right channel.
Now I can sort of zoom in a little bit and get a feel for how much sound is going on here. So you can see these individual things that are happening bloop-wise. I'm going to just click on this little plus, and I can zoom in and out. That's the whole list of sounds, and then here's the individual bleeps, and you can see their what's called a waveform.
Here you maximize the program there too, so we can see the whole thing on the screen.
Okay, yeah, there you go. So that gives you a closer view of that full screen, and you can sort of see it happening.
That's each individual note as it's playing.
And again, when you hit play, you get that little bloop. So if I just want to cut one sound out, I can first zoom in, and then I can just take that individual sound and copy. And I can make a new. So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly go to edit, paste, and paste that sound in. So now I just get this.
Right there.
Yep, totally easy to work with.
Great. Now you can have that as a menu sound effect, or when you pick up an item, whatever you need.
Maybe I don't like something about it too. One thing about Audacity is that you can make little adjustments to your sounds. So if I go up to effects, I can change the pitch, the speed. Anything that I want to adjust, I can add more echo to it or have it fade in a little bit more. I like the pitch change. It's pretty neat. Say I just want to go, okay, right now it says it's a D sharp. I'll just drop it down a bit.
Oh, you can even set the exact note. Yeah, I don't know much about music theory, but if you wanted to have it match your soundtrack or to be in harmony, you can edit your sound effects so that they match more completely.
So now it sounds like this.
A little different.
A little bit different sound. Maybe I want to go a little bit deeper with it. Let's actually make it a little slower.
Slow motion sound effect. Oh, I see it lasts a bit longer now.
Yeah, so you have a little bit longer sound. So if you download a sound and you're like, oh, it's not exactly perfect, maybe you can just adjust it using Audacity. You can use it. One of the cool things about Audacity, too, is that every time you make a sound, it takes a copy of that sound, so it doesn't edit your original sound unless you really want it to. So when you're ready and you have a sound you want to use in your game, you actually go to Export Audio over here, and you click on Export, and it's going to save out that individual sound as a waveform file.
WAV file is an uncompressed audio file. So they're known for being large in size, but for short sound effects, they're good in games because there's no compression. That means the computer takes no processing power in order to play it. It just starts playing it right away. And so if you're doing something like a gun shooting off or picking up an item, something that's going to be played on a moment's notice, having a WAV file is really nice. If you're doing the background music for your game, something that's more long-term, you might want to think like an MP3 file.
MP3 is a really common music format. Obviously, you've heard it before. MP3 is a good format to save as if you're trying to create a backing music track. There's also the OGG, the OGG Vorbis. That's a compressed sound that is used in games a lot. There's other sound formats. Those are just kind of the ones I see used most often as the WAV file or else the OGG file.
And check with your game engine because a lot of them have built-in support for these file types.
Right. For example, Unity is going to have a more robust sound editor coming out soon. It's going to have a lot of features that allow you to edit your sound right in Unity. So that might be really cool. Right now, I like Audacity for this purpose. If I just want to cut and paste a little bit, you can even edit voice tracks in this, and I've done it, where you record somebody talking, and you're like, oh, that person was speaking too slowly. You can speed it up, and it won't raise the pitch. They won't sound like a chipmunk. They'll just sound faster. It's actually really neat. So if you need to cram a sound into a quicker amount of space, you can actually do that in this, and it won't. Or you can adjust the pitch. Say you have an alien character or something, you can do reverb on voices.
Yeah, if you want a chipmunk character, just upping their pitch, you can have that kind of Alvin and Chipmunks-like effect. So this is a great way to make assets, but what if I don't want to actually spend time making every asset for my game? What am I going to do now?
Okay, well, a lot of people are like, oh, that sounds like it's really deep, and it can be.
It's a lot of work to make every asset for your game.
I just showed you one place, Free Sound, where you can get the sound effects for your game, but let's talk about just some of the considerations that you have for there. First of all, your game does need to stand out. I feel like that's kind of important. And having unique art, even if even if it's kind of beginnerish or different, or if you find an artist somewhere, it'll make your game look different from other people's games. And if everybody's games looks the same, it's harder to get noticed.
It's a double-edged sword, because if I'm not good at making art, I can use existing art that looks really great and have a better looking game. But then if my better looking game looks too templatey, looks really similar to other games, doesn't really have assets that are unique to my character, it's kind of a blank, everyman, generic fantasy, it's not going to be as nice, not going to have as many players, not going to be as engaging. That
doesn't mean that I should just go out on the internet and grab whatever art I want, because a lot of times that art does not belong to you, and you have to consider the licenses
that
of everything.
IP law and
sound as well, which is one of the reasons that I showed that Creative Commons sound, is because that's a Creative Commons that can be used as long as you give thanks and attribution.
We'll talk more about Creative Commons in a moment, but you basically have to make this choice of yourself. How much am I going to do myself versus getting for my game? What am I going to spend money on? How much money am I willing to spend on an artist? Figure out those considerations first, figure out your budget, figure out what you're willing to do, and then you'll find a solution that works for you. Even if you have zero budget and zero time, there's a solution out there to get art. Now, is it going to be the perfect art for your game, perfect assets that you need? That depends, but there are lots of solutions out there. So definitely don't give up and say, oh, my budget's too low, in order to find stuff that's really going to make your game shine.
And I always encourage people not to think of art as too mysterious. A lot of people are kind of afraid, like, oh, I don't have any talent to create art. You'd be surprised what you can do with some practice and just taking up a tool and giving it a shot.
Art is a skill. I had a really great art teacher in college who constantly talked about the stereotype that an artist is someone who's born with artistic talent. And what you find is people who are really into art, they just draw all the time. So if you constantly aren't sketching in your sketch pad and doodling everywhere, you're probably not as good as art as someone who does. Doesn't mean that you can't do it. Doesn't mean you can't put in a few hours, practice, and become as good as they are. It's just a matter of
time-consuming.
How much time you put into it. So let's actually talk about finding those assets. First, let's talk about the Creative Commons in a little more detail. It's a license that just means it's free. I can do whatever I want with it?
It depends a little bit on what the actual license agreement is. The Creative Commons license that I have on my screen here, for example, talks a little bit about the attribution and what you have to do. So in this particular case, a Creative Commons attribution license, you are free to share, adapt, remix, and even commercially.
And that isn't every Creative Commons license.
Right.
That's this particular Creative Commons. Creative Commons is a theme set up by a bunch of lawyers to make sharing of assets easier amongst creative type people.
And you can learn more about this if you go to creativecommons.org.
Awesome. Great website. And also freesound.org, we mentioned earlier, is a great place to find free open source sounds. I'm also a big fan of the Noun project, which are open source noun images that you can put into your game. So you can find a bunch of free assets that way, or free, but you just have to give credit to the artist, which is a pretty reasonable trade-off. But where else can I go to get assets? A lot of the stores have their own places built right in. I mean, what I mean by stores, a lot of engines built into that engine have an asset store you can go to. Like
Unity has its own asset store, and Game Maker is going to be coming out with one, or if they haven't already, I think it's already in beta. And there's also just asset stores out there. TurboSquid is one example of
the website you can go to and download any sort of 3D object.
Some of it's free, some of it costs money. Always just check the licenses on what you're downloading and make sure that it's used for the purpose that you want to use it for.
Yeah.
So if it is something you download for free, make sure that it's used for a commercial purpose and you're allowed to do that before you try to make any money off that asset.
And that's really great, because if you need, say, a really nicely rendered car, you could spend hours trying to do that yourself. But if someone has a nice car and they're asking $25 for it, this might be worth 10 hours of your time. You throw some money towards an artist way, who's just another creative professional just trying to get by. You get the asset for use in your game. It's a win-win situation. It's really great that we have access to such stores out there. It's again another reason why indies are so popular right now, because there's so many ways for them to get rid of all those hurdles that impeded development before.
It's a big consideration when you're getting stuff from asset stores is the mix and match factor. Be sure that everything that you take looks good together, because a lot of times you'll get a high poly character and a low poly trash can and a
Everything's
high poly
pink except for that one green thing. It's got to match.
You have to be sure that your stuff matches. If not, see if the license allows you to modify it. Maybe you want to put a different texture on that object and make it blend in with the rest of your world. But you can still download the 3D object and save yourself time modeling.
But that sounds like work, and I don't have time to work. But maybe I have some money. Where can I go to actually pay someone to do that?
Oh, you're talking about hiring people.
Yeah, hiring
That's different.
people.
Okay,
it's a concept. There's something else you could do, hiring people.
Some people just find a friend that's really good at this stuff and team up, which is totally an option, right? I mean, I have an artist friend or I have a musician friend.
There's a lot of local clubs
Music is
colleges.
my weakest spot, so I usually get somebody else to do the music for me, and then we come up with an agreement. What are you being paid for? Or are you being, is this for a fun project that we're just going to do for fun? So, that is, there's a deeper level of that, which is to actually hire somebody and pay them to do the work for you, which in that case, you may be looking at hiring a freelancer through something like Elance.
Elance and Odesk are two websites I've used often to hire small artists, musicians, even developers, whatever I need for my project. There's a whole great website you can go to. It handles the payment transactions with them. It has a whole system for making sure that they're doing the work. You're just paying them to, say, browse Facebook all day. It's a really great system. I would highly recommend it. And, you might say, okay, yeah, you might have money to pay for it. I don't have money. But it might not cost as much as you think. And again, you have to factor in your own time, because if you're going to have to put 10 hours into something to learn how to do it, but you can hire a professional to do it for 25 or less, that's probably worth your time as a trade-off, just from your ability to spend that 10 hours making your game better.
It's another situation where having that business that you've created helps you out to figure out the legalities of who owns what and the process too. So you get some of a little contract paperwork type stuff, but you'll have to navigate that process.
Makes sense. And that is more stuff we're going to talk about in the business portion, which I believe is the next module.
Yeah, I think next we're talking
business
about
models,
businesses.
how to actually make your company a successful, profitable business.
I'm excited about that.
Excellent. So we'll just take a quick 10-minute break and we'll see you there. Welcome back to Game Production. Now we're going to talk about business models and how to actually make some money with these games and how games are making money in the industry today.
Cool. So let's go ahead and get started.
Yeah. So here's an overview of what we're going to talk about. As I said, game monetization, how games are making money, how to understand your target audience. So when you're making your game, who are you actually making it for? Who's actually going to play it? And what are the risks of doing game development? You know, there might be some costs associated with it. So we'll talk about your risks or potential downsides to being an indie and going out and making your games.
And again, this is really basic stuff. We're just going to be talking about an overview of the basic concepts behind it. So if you want to learn more, we'll give you resources and hopefully you can dig in a little bit deeper later on.
Just give you somewhere to start, some basic information if you haven't done it before. So let's talk a little bit about monetization. That's kind of the fancy word for how stuff makes money.
Yeah, monetization is a weird word. I don't know if all my spell checkers like it very much.
No, most spell checkers are not fond of it. But there's, as we mentioned before, premium, free, and freemium are the three main ways games monetize now. Premium games, we talked about it before, is kind of this older method of you buy software and then you play it.
Well, I don't know if I would call it an older method. There's always been like arcade machines where you stick a coin in and you play per play. So that's kind of an older model too. But it's still a model that exists today. It's not a model that's going away.
Yeah, exactly. I'm really glad we emphasized that because premium games are here to stay for sure. They're making tons of money and there's lots of games out there. In fact, most games that come out for consoles and PCs are premium games. So let's talk a little bit of what I mean by a premium experience, what defines that. Because I don't just mean AAA games. And AAA is the industry term for games made by a large company with a large budget, have that extra amount of polish to it. But there are indie games as well that are a premium experience.
So I have a question. I'm going to interrupt you. You hear AAA a lot. Is it such a thing as like a double A and an A and a B?
Absolutely. They're often talked about because it's kind of hard to figure out, like, is this an A game, a double A? Is this a B game? You know, kind of like a B movie.
But it used to be a greater distinction,
actually a thing. Most of the time, it's usually just a term to distinct those like high-end, high-budget, big production games are called AAA, and then everything else is just kind of not AAA or indie usually.
Yeah, so that's kind of the distinction usually. Usually they say AAA, indie. Sometimes casual is another term you'll hear sometimes. Or
yeah. And stuff like casual and what the style of game is completely independent to this experience. So when I say premium, there could be casual games that are premium experiences. It's not just that, mobile games are all freemium or should all be freemium, right? It depends on what your game is and what monetization method works best.
If I buy a game on my mobile device and I pay $2 for it up front, it's considered a premium game. That's what they call a premium pricing model.
Yeah, exactly. And so talking about the characteristics of that isn't just that, you pay up front for it. That's the literal definition. But characteristics of those games is that they have an endpoint. At some point, you've reached the end of the content. Now, that might be a game that has an open world afterwards, but there's definitely a story that will end. You know, a game like Grand Theft Auto, for instance, has a percentage complete, and you can get 100% of the game. You can still play after you complete it, so it doesn't force you to end. It's not a completely linear game, but it's still a premium experience, and there's a definite point where you are done with the content of the game. You've completed it.
Now, what about DLC? Can I get more content for the same game?
Yeah, that's where premium games can kind of have a hybrid model, and a lot more premium games are including DLC. So it absolutely can have that, and it's still a premium experience, but you'll see that it's very limited. Most players won't go for that DLC. It's kind of like a different way of doing expansion packs. Before, you'd have a game, and then after a while, a sequel would come out. And maybe the sequel would be very similar to the first with a couple extra features. And nowadays, instead of going to that trouble, they're just releasing the first game and then including in-app purchases to get more content. So if you do see those kinds of in-app purchases, they're limited. They're usually not in the game whatsoever. You can't buy stuff within the game. You usually have to go outside to a menu, purchase something at a store. Or if it is in the game, it's buried somewhere deep. It's not very deeply integrated into the game's experience.
Cool.
So that's in the contrast to a freemium game where game never really has an end. It always continues. What do you think you'll find in all freemium games, or at least the vast majority of them, is that they're a continuous experience. There's no definite endpoint where you want to stop playing. The two examples I put for freemium here are League of Legends and Temple Run.
So League of Legends is not a casual game.
No, absolutely not. In fact, some people might not even realize it is freemium at first. When I say that, a lot of people think of these quick, casual little mobile games or games on Facebook, but League of Legends is a free game, completely free to play, and you have an optional way to pay some money to purchase some more characters, get some different styles of weapons. They're completely optional things, but you can continually play the game forever. You don't have to stop playing. It's completely free otherwise.
And what's interesting for you as a developer that might create a freemium game is that when you create a premium game, you're putting a price tag on it and saying, hey, this game costs this much. When you create a freemium game, you're letting your users decide how much they think the game is worth. And some people can spend quite a bit of money on a game like League of Legends or Temple Run that they maybe wouldn't have spent as much, or maybe they wouldn't have spent as much if they had just bought the game outright. So you can actually stand to make a pretty good deal of money with your monetization scheme. Now, that isn't to say to be exploitive of your players and try to nickel and dime them for everything, because people tend to resent that.
You can't make people do in-app purchases, but if you offer stuff that people really want deep into the game experience, people are willing to put in money to a game that they already love. I play, say, League of Legends over and over again, hundreds of hours I put into it. Then maybe I consider buying an extra skin, buying an extra item, getting a refill of a new item, Temple Run. Those are not usually when I haven't played the game yet or haven't been engaged. So the freemium experience, the monetization comes after the user is already hooked, after the user is already engaged. And that monetization is deeply ingrained. It's constantly reminding you and telling you, hey, you could buy this extra upgrade. You can see this extra hero. You can pay for this extra thing. The way the game makes money is very deeply integrated into the gameplay experience. And if it's a really well-done game, it's done well, seamlessly, doesn't seem wrong. If it's a badly done game, you reach a wall and it's like, to get past this wall, spend $100. Those games don't necessarily do
we want
as
to talk
well.
about some of the ways that games do make money, some of the different methods?
Yeah, we talk about these free games making money, and there's two main ways that free/freemium games will monetize: in-app purchases and advertising. Now, most games will get the most money out of in-app purchases. That is more common. You get a direct route of people paying you, and people are really willing to spend money on games that they care about. And those in-app purchases could be anything, expansions of more content, different items, upgrades, some type of in-game currency is very, very common in freemium experiences. But it's what we're talking about is an in-game experience, something in-game, not necessarily press this button to buy a t-shirt for the game that's going to be mailed to you. Some games will do that, but that's more of a merchandising separate thing. It doesn't really count as an in-app purchase for what we're talking about.
And it can be stuff that affects the play of the game, or it can be stuff that's just visual, like skins for your avatar, for example. You can buy new costumes for your characters, and that tends to monetize too.
Yeah, and better games tend to do stuff that is not required for the player to have in order to enjoy the game. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but it's usually something that is very optional to the experience. Again, like in League of Legends, it's an extra skin or some other more currency, which you could earn if you just played the game more, but it's saving you some time by getting it all at once ahead of time. And so the other way that free games monetize is advertising. Of course, there's banner ads in games. We've all seen it, pop-up ads, and the developer makes money when users click on those ads. There's also video ads, interstitial ads that people could watch, and there's also offers that you could fill out. So a lot of games now will have it where, hey, you fill out this offer of some kind, sign up for this service, do a trial of this, watch that video, and you'll get rewarded. You get this item, you'll get some coin, and whenever you as a player do that experience, even if you didn't spend any money, the advertiser paid the developer some amount of money for that, and that's one of the ways that the games are making money.
And it's pretty common in mobile to have like an ad-supported version, maybe pay $1 to remove the ads, and that could be one other way to monetize too.
Yeah, but those don't necessarily monetize as well. Ads pay not a whole lot of money. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the numbers that I've seen people get for these kinds of monetization
these are really interesting
methods.
numbers. It's good to know up front what you're getting
into
here.
So let's talk about advertising. It's usually measured in CPM, which means cost per mille, which is 1,000 in Latin. So that means for every 1,000 impressions, that's how much money you earn. So if I have 1,000 people who played a game and they each look at one ad, I could earn about 50 cents to $2 is what I've seen most people quote as the industry average income.
And you've got to be careful you're not spending more money than that acquiring those users in the first place.
Yeah, your costs want to be lower, but 50 cents to $2 isn't a whole lot of money. So if I don't have a whole lot of users, if I only have 1,000,
remember, that's per
2,000,
1,000 users. It's not per user.
No, that's
right.
per 1,000 users. Per 1,000 impressions of an ad, I should say.
Oh, okay, right.
So let's say I have 1 million users. Let's say 500,000 play today. Let's say they each look at 4 ads.
Oh.
All right, now I'm starting to get some money that's maybe not great, but it actually, when it adds up to some decent income. So if you have less than 100,000 users, ads are not really going to be a viable monetization method for your game. It's just one of the frank facts about the industry right now. That said, it's a perfectly viable method to try and get millions of users. Millions of users are obtainable, but you shouldn't just rely, well, I'll have an ad in it and thus it will make money.
So what about those in-app purchases? How well are those making money for people?
Well, you can earn a lot more money per user on that, but another point is that very small percentage of people will actually pay for something in-game. I'm curious to hear in the chat, actually, how many people have paid for an in-app purchase in a game that was free, because it's only 0.5 to 3% of users will ever do so in a particular game. And if you think about that, that means that over 97% of your users will never pay for something in-game. So
or what you call a free rider.
Well, you don't want to think bad about these users, because if you have your game, that the coolest part about your game, the thing that makes your game unique, special, awesome, is behind a paywall. And say you have just some bland, normal game, but if you get this awesome item, or if you unlock this awesome level, that's great, but you put a paywall behind it, less than 3% of your user base will ever see that content. And it's really hard to grow your game and expand and really have good monetization if only a small percentage of your user base see it. That's why you see the most successful freemium games give away all of the primary content for free. You aren't buying power or spending money to get more powerful in the game so that every other player has to spend money, because that alienates the free players.
It becomes completely imbalanced, right? So there's a lot of design considerations that you have to think about when you're going to create a freemium game. You have to think in the design, how am I going to monetize this? What are my options going to be? It's not something that you can expect to tack on at the last minute and hope to make it work out for you. I've seen people kind of, I'm not really sure, I'm just going to quickly add these power-ups, and it usually kind of falls apart. It works better if it's really ingrained with the design of your game. And if you can't see yourself doing that, maybe a premium game model is better off.
And different games have different methods, and some games don't work as a freemium experience, and some games don't work as a premium experience. It really depends on your design, what you should do for your game, and there's no wrong answer.
Right.
So now we've talked a little bit about that. Let's talk about understanding your target audience, who you're actually going to be marketing your game towards, who's going to be playing your game. Because you don't just want to make assumptions. I find a lot of people assume themselves as the player, and that's good. You want to make a game that's fun for you.
Sure, that's fine. You can make a game for yourself.
But they project other things to other people, and I find this especially common with people making stereotypes about different types of players. They say, this is for teenage boys, and they like this certain kinds of content, and older suburban moms won't like that. And what you actually find in the marketplace is usually that particular example of a stereotype is the opposite. A lot of gamers now are a very different demographic than what you assume. A lot of gamers are older. Gamers are in very different situations in life. And teenagers are not actually a huge market. And they don't necessarily spend money, and they're not necessarily as into complex, weird, deep systems types games, RPGs, real-time strategies, as much as an older crowd might be. And
you have the patience to learn all those.
This might be different than what you might assume, but you should do some market research and say, hey, who likes these kinds of games? What are they interested in? How are they playing it? How are they finding these games?
I've got some stats on my screen. Do we want to jump over and take
let's
a look?
See them.
Yeah. So, this website is the ESA. It's the ESA. I'm going to go up there, theesa.com. If you go ESA.com, it's something else. The cool thing about this website is that it has a lot of data about who's playing and buying games. They do research in the industry to get stats for who's getting games where and how much they're spending and all that kind of stuff. So it's really interesting to find out. They say that 59% of Americans play video games right now. And here's the total amount that we've spent $21.53 billion on video games.
It's a good amount of money. It's a good amount.
It's a pretty big industry. And this is what we're talking about here. Digital content, including games, add-ons, mobile applications, and subscriptions, social networking accounted for 53% of game sales. So that's freemium models.
That's a very large percentage, considering, premium games are talking about $50, $60 experience often, and these in-app purchases are $1, $2 experiences, but they add up a lot, and it's a very significant part of the industry.
So you may have heard these statistics elsewhere, that the average game player is now 31 years old. The most frequent purchaser is 35 years old. Sometimes that's parents buying games for kids.
But oftentimes that's people buying games for themselves. Gamers are getting older as a demographic, so you shouldn't necessarily just target just one set. The more broad you can make your game, more broad appeal, the better. And that doesn't mean I need to make my game more casual, or I need to make my game simpler, or I need to make my game use a certain art style or not involve zombies or some other thing that might not necessarily appeal to different demographics. But you realize that you should do this research as to what's popular where, figure out for your game, your design, what's going to work, what people are interested in, and also understand conventions. There's a lot of other games out there, and players aren't playing in a vacuum. For instance, I like first-person shooters, and whenever I go to play a first-person shooter, I naturally move my hand onto the WASD keys, because I play on PC, and that's the standard controls for moving around in most first-person shooter games I've played. But if you don't teach that in your game, you have no instructions to that, and your target audience are people who don't typically play first-person shooters, they're going to have no idea how to move around your game. I've seen so many high-quality games do badly in the marketplace because they make an assumption of what the player already knows.
They don't have good tutorials.
And it's really easy to integrate a tutorial or some kind of messaging that lets the player know, WASD to move around, and then you can play the game and move on, and everything else makes sense. But just those small little seeds of, I'm used to seeing this level of stats, I know what a skill tree is, I know what leveling up means. These are terms that gamers might know, but other people might not be aware of yet.
So I find the best way to find out what your target audience thinks of your game is, first of all, ask them, right? That's great. But also play test.
Yep, exactly. We were talking about that a lot before. Just buy some pizza, go find a street corner, get a demo of your game, and say, hey, I'll give you a slice of this pizza if I can watch you play my game. And just watch them for 3 to 5 minutes. And you do this with people on the street, not your friends, not your parents, not people who like you
someone
in
your target audience is the person to find. If you're making games for kids, find some kids, and get their parents' permission. Make sure that
anyone underage.
Right, exactly. And we've done it. Make sure that the parents sign a contract. Make sure that the kid understands, and then we'll get started playing a game and give them a candy or something afterwards and thank them for their help.
The more playtesting you have, the more feedback you have, the better your game experience is going to be. As we were mentioning earlier with agile development, you want to get in front of people as early as possible and iterate on it. You don't want to develop in a vacuum, because people aren't playing in a vacuum either. People play in a context of other games.
And definitely find games that are similar to the game that you're trying to make and see what kind of conventions they use. What's standard? What kind of icons do those games use? If there's a specific icon that means health in every game that's similar to yours, it's probably a good idea to, maybe not the exact same, but that your users will expect to see that icon, and you can give them the benefit of the doubt that they'll understand what that means. So it's good to check out the conventions. Don't develop in a vacuum. Don't just try out one game. We'll talk about playing critically a little bit later, but always check out, see what's going on in the world around you. Don't let it paralyze you or psych you out, but just play with an informed idea of what you're going to make and use those same conventions in your own work.
And something else to think about is not just the context of in your language, in your region. We're very lucky right now. You are understanding what I'm saying because you understand English, I presume. Maybe my words are being translated at some later date. But not all of the world speaks English. There's millions of players out there in all sorts of other languages. And if a business point of view, it is worth your time and money to think about your game translated into other languages, available in more regions. Hey, if you could communicate that button instead of in words, maybe you have some type of universal symbol that would be more easily understand in people regardless of the language. You're not just helping out players, in a foreign language, but what if someone's dyslexic? What if someone can't read? What if someone just doesn't want to read? You're making the game more accessible for everybody by being mindful of what you're doing that is a cultural thing or a cultural stereotype or a cultural norm.
Other thing to think about too is content issues. I've done some experiments with like game violence, and game violence has different norms in different cultures, and you'd be surprised what's okay in one country maybe isn't okay in another country.
Yeah, what's perfectly innocent here might be considered really, really rude or profane in another country. So you might think that you have a kids game, but based on maybe it shows someone in scantily clad clothes that would be acceptable here, but not in certain Middle Eastern countries. Or perhaps you're showing red blood, and that is considered really, really violent and against taboo in, say, Germany, I know specifically. And you might want to have a version where it's colored green or something like that.
And if you're out there from different countries, you probably know games are localized differently depending on content and language in different countries. So.
And there's no universal answer of what you need to do for each country. But you do need to spend a little bit of time and study that market, and it's worth your time. We're talking millions of gamers and much more of an audience. You shouldn't just say, well, I'm only going to develop for my home country, because the world is small, and there's a lot of people that you can develop games for and a lot of players out there, and they want to play your game too.
So let's talk about, finally, for this module, some of the risks and challenges that we're going to face creating a game business and monetizing and trying to make money. Yeah, what are the risks and problems that you're going to end up with?
We encourage everyone to go out there and be an indie, but it's not completely without its risks. And the number one risk is, of course, cost. A lot of the tools that we mentioned today are free. There's even more free tools out there. But if you wanted to do something more advanced, you wanted a more advanced tool like 3D Max or Photoshop, you might have to invest some money into that.
And time is money. And my time is limited and your time is limited.
So you might want to hire someone else to do assets. That's going to have cost. There might be some store fees to actually get up on the store. I believe the Windows Store right now is a $19 one-time fee in order to get out on
And you do want to check the fees for certain game engines. For example, they may be free up front, but if you want to do a pro version, or if you make up to a certain amount of money, double check and make sure that you're still good on your licensing fees. So that those are all risks. And I mean, you also are taking your own personal time out to make these games.
That's a great point. You mentioned it earlier. It's your own time is worth something, because if I'm going to work on something for 10 hours, that's going to have some cost to it. You can do everything for free if you spend years of your life studying art, studying programming, studying everything. I mean, how long have you spent learning your game development skills? How many hours would you imagine?
God, I don't even know if I could say hours, but it's certainly been more than a decade.
Many years
of study. Right. Yeah, yes. Just in terms of, and still learning all the time. So sometimes you have to balance the weight of, is it more expensive for me to spend time learning this skill, or is it more expensive for me to buy that asset? How much money am I worth right now? How much time is it going to take me? Or could I buy this asset and use it and spend that time as money, basically?
Yeah, and that's a decision that you have to make. Again, there's no right answer, but it's something that you want to consider of how much of your own personal time you want to invest. As far as risk as well, you might, say invest a lot of your personal time, maybe invest a lot of your money, release a game, and it doesn't do so well in the marketplace. It's not going to make money back right away. And there could be all sorts of reasons why that is. People didn't like it. It's not as fun as you hoped it would be. And you can mitigate those risks. You can study what people are doing. But the best way is to just start small. And again, we keep emphasizing it, iterate, add more to it over time, because if you know you have something good at its core, you know you have something simple that works, you can add more to and expand upon that, and you aren't going to overly invest in an idea that is just not going to pan out.
Example I always use is like the Angry Birds. That was like their 30-somethingth game.
No, actually, that was their 52nd game.
Was it 50-something? Yeah.
Rovio, the makers of Angry Birds.
They made tons of games.
I'm sure you've heard of Angry Birds.
Right.
They made 51 games
of
relative obscurity
right.
before they made Angry Birds. It's a really great point, because a lot of people expect instant success when they go out in the marketplace, that I can just make a game, put it out there, and it's going to do great. And it might be a really great game, but then there's all the marketing you have to do to get in front of people. Maybe the theming didn't quite fit, or you've got to figure out what platform it's on, what language is it in. And for every number of reasons it doesn't do well, you learn from those mistakes. You learn by getting it out there and doing it. And all the successful game developers you see out there have usually made a game before that. They've usually done something and experiment on it. It's just like art. We were talking about art earlier, how everyone can learn it. You wouldn't expect an artist their first painting they ever made to be a masterpiece. Artists doodle all the time. So you should also doodle when it comes to game development. You
Sure, you can doodle in code.
Yeah, exactly. You should doodle when it comes to design. Write out some design docs, plan out some ideas, make some spreadsheets. The more you do something, the better you're going to be at it. And that's just the best way to learn and try new stuff out.
And be willing to listen to people's feedback about the games that you've made. If people are saying, especially the same thing, if you have 5 playtesters and they all have the same comment, I'd time to take that comment seriously and think about what you could do to improve maybe your next game release or maybe the current one. You don't necessarily have to iterate on one until it's perfect. You can release and move on. So you can just think about it as a balancing act. Maybe you release 10 games before you really like the one you've made.
And again, this is all very general advice. It's not very specific, but every individual problem is different. Every individual game might need something different to make it better. And learning how to recognize what those problems are is the key to becoming a good designer. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next module. We're going to have some links where you can continue learning after this MVA and also learn how to look at games with a critical eye and play like a designer. So
we're going to take another little break here for 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back and wrap everything up with a little more information for you about what to look at next and how to get in touch with us and ask us questions too, right?
Yep. See you in a bit.
Hi, welcome back to Game Production Basics. This is our last module of the day. It went by kind of fast. This is in our final talk. We're just going to talk about what to do from here, where to go next, and what you can do to continue to learn after we're done talking to you. So let's just go over briefly what we're going to talk in this last module. First of all, where to go from here, what things you could check out.
And how you can play games like a designer, where you can learn to have games with a critical eye and really analyze the games you're going to be playing and enjoy them for the games that they are, but also learn from them and how to make better games just by playing other games. That sounds fun.
Yeah, I love to play games, so always are for me.
And we're going to be mentioning lots of links throughout as well that you can check out.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up some websites and just show you some basic websites that you can look at. And if you have any questions, additional questions, we're going to stick around a little bit after we're done talking to answer your questions in the chat.
And feel free to ask now as well. So let's talk about where to go from here. Great resources that you can check out. Here's some links that are, again, not the only links out there, but some that we would recommend starting first to have really great resources to find things.
So tutorials, where can I get some tutorials from?
Well, obviously, Microsoft Virtual Academy has tons of great game development specific tutorials and a lot of great content talking about all sorts of different game engines. So I would highly recommend checking it out, checking out other videos. You might find something that's exactly the tool that you want to learn.
And we have a specific link here for game development topics that's going to be continued to be added to throughout the next coming month as well. So if you don't see what you're interested in now, right now we've got this cool header with Babylon.js, but there might be some different stuff happening too.
Yeah,
so
keep checking it out. There's always going to be more content on MVA.
Yep. There's also tutorials for the individual game engines.
Yeah, so if you're wanting to do Unity development, as we mentioned in Module 2, you can check out the individual engines' websites, and they have tons of great tutorials, video content, written content, sample code. All the engines have great content of that. So we wanted to take you to each page and show you where you can get that. Unity3d.com/learn is for Unity, obviously.
They also have live training sessions kind of like this one where you can learn, and they're also recorded. So you can, and this session's also being recorded, so you can watch it later if you want to rewatch and get some of these URLs if you miss anything.
Absolutely.
Yep. And there's also a tutorial site for Yo-Yo Games.
Yeah, it's Game Maker Studio.
Yep.
It also has great tutorials, resources, sample code. I actually really like the Game Maker documentation. They do a really good job with it.
And they have tutorials. In fact, when you fire Game Maker up, there's a big tutorials. Like you can't miss it. Right there. It says
right in when you started. Yeah, there's a little splash screen.
This is all the documentation.
We didn't show that in the demo, but you can use that to load one of the sample projects, one of the tutorial projects. And actually, it's nice because their tutorials appear in Game Maker itself and show you where to click. It's a lot of text reading, but it's definitely worth doing. So I would run through them for sure.
And here's where you get the tutorials for Construct 2 as well. It's tutorials slash tutorials.
Again, great documentation. Whenever you have a problem or looking up a specific issue that you want, a specific code you want to figure out, or how do you do a certain function, what it does, they have all of that listed up there. It's a great resource, so we constantly reference it.
Interested in how to make a platform game, or you even just want to learn how to make a game for Facebook? You know, how to make a game and different design aspects of games too. They've got pages and pages and pages of stuff you could check out.
Now, that's all good, but that's still more tutorials on making a game. What if I wanted to talk more about the design of a game or the assets? What kind of websites could I go to learn about that?
So one of the sites that I like a lot is Gamasutra. This site is for game industry, and they talk a lot about what goes on at the Game Developers Conference, for example, and they interview the developers of games to get their feedback on what kind of game they're working on now. They've got some articles up about Sunset Overdrive, so that's pretty cool. You can learn about how game making of one of our Xbox One games.
They do a lot of different posts, and it's written by people in the industry. In fact, you can even contribute your own blog posts, your own postmortems of your own games, and if it gets popular enough, it'll float up and be a featured article. So you can find all sorts of perspectives from small indie developers to big AAA companies and everything in between. It's a really great blog resource.
I really like the
day.
postmortems, which is that's a phrase that means after death, but basically it's a post-release article that they write telling what went wrong. And you can also, sometimes they show free videos from conferences. So like if you go to GDC, if you can't make it out, say GDC, it can be kind of expensive to go to that conference, but you can actually watch some of the videos that they have. Some of them are free, and you can watch those sessions and learn about all kinds of neat issues about game creation.
Very cool. And they also have a sister site, too, called Game Career Guide, which is a really great resource if you want to get a job in the games industry. Because not only does it post all the latest jobs that you can look at the positions, see what they're requiring, see what is available out there, but they also do a game developer survey every year and figure out exactly how much developers are making in the industry. So if you want to know, hey, if I'm expecting to be a game designer, how much would I expect to make after 3 years experience, 5 years experience, and knowing exactly how much people make, it can be really, really useful information. So
they just posted one of those in August of this year. So they've got a relatively up-to-date one. And it talks about the roles that we talked about, the designer, developer roles.
It breaks it down more specific, too. Yeah, level designer or texture artist versus rigger, all sorts of different things.
And they've even got forums where you can look up to find people to collaborate with you on your project.
Yeah, really, really great resource.
So this is a website that I like a lot. It's a Pixel Prospector. We're not affiliated with them at all. Pixel Prospector. It's just a general game development resource for indies. Lots of resources, including where to find graphics, where to find sound, where to hire designers, and links to some of the engines that we've talked about and others. So if you're interested in more text information, some charts, etc., you can find a lot of good information here.
Yeah, there's a lot of really random guides on there, but they're all really, really great, informative. It's useful just to start to find links of where you can go to, and it might be a nice write-up there too.
Maybe you're looking for a very specific tutorial, like a pixel art tutorial, or you're looking for how to get started in 3D and you want a more in-depth how-to. You can find a lot of that stuff here. And also marketing. And they talk a lot about how to market, how to distribute, what does it mean to self-publish, and how do you walk through that process. They've got a whole business section that you can look at and learn more about some of the business stuff, starting at running a business. Some of the stuff that we've talked about, you maybe get a little bit more information about postmortems and other things in this site too.
Very cool. What if I'm more into video shows? What show would you recommend?
This show, Extra Credits, is a really cool show. They have like a stick figure art aesthetic. Maybe you've seen them before on YouTube. This is their website here, extracredits.net, and they do have a YouTube channel. They've put out a lot of content over the years, digging really deep into specific games, doing like a design club focus, and talking about individual decisions made in games and why they work, talking about what parts of games they like and what games maybe you haven't played that you should try. They do a whole series on that.
And this isn't just what's fun, what's not. It's not a game review show. It's looking at the games from a design perspective. How did they design this level? Why did the designers make this choice? What type of monetization methods are common? What's working in the industry? What isn't working in the industry? What's working overseas? What the game market like in Brazil or other countries? They all have different episodes that focus on some specific issue that range about 5 to 15 minutes long. They're fairly short each episode. Some of the episodes can be longer too, like 30 minutes.
Yeah, it depends on what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think
sometimes
it's like
they'll do Twitch streaming and all kinds of other stuff too. So
they've had like 4 seasons of content now.
They even recommend some books and other things that you can read to get more accustomed to.
But yeah, there's a lot of really great resources on that page. Go back into the old episodes, find a topic that interests you, and just start watching. It's really great to have on in the background while you're developing, while you're doing something else, while you're going to the gym, and just learn more about the industry. Constantly train that designer's eye, thinking about how to critically take apart games. And that leads us into the next point of what we want to talk about, is how to play games like game designers do. So what is that like? Am I playing games wrong?
Yeah,
what does that mean?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've been playing games for a really long time. I don't think I'm necessarily playing games the wrong way, but I know that ever since I started making my own games, something has kind of changed in the way that I approach how to play certain games. I'm always looking for things like, maybe there's a texture map that I'm really interested in and I'm trying to figure out how it was painted. Or maybe there's a character that I would like to see the inside and outside of and kind of turn around and look at how they're developed. Or a map that I'm really interested in. The level design is really fascinating. If you look at how level designers come up with a way to convince the player to take a particular path versus another path, and what tricks they use to hide secrets on the map versus reveal things. You can learn a lot by paying attention to those tricks of the trade and really taking those apart in your brain and analyzing them, picking them apart. And where do they not want you to look, and what happens if you look there?
Yeah, it's kind of, the analogy I use is, if you know a lot about the way movies are made, when you watch a movie, you see a scene, you're like, okay, this is a medium close-up, that's on a dolly shot, they backlit this. You kind of can see the tricks of the trade as you're watching a movie. It doesn't take away from your enjoyment. It's not saying you need to not enjoy games or you need to write down on a pad of paper all of these little notes as you're playing them. But as you see how games are made, as you understand how it's made more, you'll just notice more and more tricks of, oh, I see how they did that. I see why that AI made that decision. I see why that was done there. I see what information I'm shown on the screen and what information they're not telling me.
Or why did they choose a particular button, for example? I mean, in a lot of shooters, you pull the trigger because it feels more like pulling a trigger on your controller. Whereas for like a jump, you hit the button. How would it feel if those were reversed? Maybe it would have a very different feel as far as a game goes, right? And all of those things are factors that go into analyzing what you're playing and asking yourself, why did they make me hammer this button a bunch of times? Did that add something to the gameplay?
Especially if you're looking for what choices they made in part of this convention. So like, oh, I see most games have that trigger for shooting. That's common. That's what people expect. This button might have an iconography to it. It's a symbol that is always used to open this kind of menu, or always for reloading, or always for health, or always for whatever feature that you want to do in a similar type game. And understanding that convention will help you when you're trying to teach players how to play your game.
Do you know what else is cool, too, is that nowadays, a lot of times you can figure out what engine a certain game was made in. So if a game was made in Unity, you can really try and figure out how it was made. If a game was made in, say, the Unreal Engine, you can usually try to take it apart somehow and figure out the insides and the guts of it. And one of the ways that I kind of got started making my own games was modding existing games.
Oh yeah, it's a great way to get started. Before these game engines were common, a lot of developers would just take existing games and start modifying the files and tweaking them to be able to start from somewhere. And you can still do that today. There's a lot of games that are open to modding.
My advice is just, take whatever game is like your favorite. If it's on the PC, this is a lot easier, right? The game on your PC, make a copy of it so you don't, damage your original files.
Keep your save files.
Keep your save files. And then try to dig out into those files and dig them apart. A lot of times on the internet, you will find open source tools, or sometimes they'll even give you the tools, depending on what the game is. Sometimes they want you to have the map making tools and stuff. And you can actually dig into those games and take apart and actually look at those game assets. And just to actually see what a live game asset looks like in your favorite titles can be really valuable to see how is that put together and where are the joints on this character and what are the facial expressions this character makes and like all kinds of neat things that you could find out from taking these games apart. And it's really, really fun. Yeah,
look behind the curtain and figure out what's going on and how you can do the same thing in your games. What paths did they take? Even just opening their tools. A lot of developers have the same level design tools that they use in studio. They release them out to the public, especially on larger titles. in the hopes that you go out and mod your own levels and release them and add more content, but you can see, okay, this is how they worked on the tools. This is how, if I worked for this studio, how I would be working. If you want to work for that studio someday, just saying, hey, I have experience in your own tool set will go a long way. But even if you aren't working at that particular studio, just knowing that you've learned a new tool and understanding how it works and taking it apart says a lot about you as a character for getting a job and improves your own skill.
A lot of people do get their start making mods, especially as a resume piece. Making your own game is one way to have a game piece, but making a mod is another way. So a lot of people will do either of those things, especially if you have a game you're really passionate about. Just even if you don't end up modding it, just take it apart. Just
play test a broken game. I remember as a kid, I won't mention the title, but there was this Star Wars game that came out around the time of Episode 1, and it was, let's just say, not so great. And I heard about QA testing and figuring out bugs and bug testing around that time. So I decided to take that game and try and document every single bug I could find. And so I was exploring various nooks and crannies, and I found all sorts of interesting things that if you walked backwards down this one hallway and through this area, you would fall through the world. And just by finding it was kind of a puzzle game in itself to figure out all the problems with it and where it went wrong. And if I worked at that studio, I could present that list to developers and they could have fixed those issues. I'm sure they had testers that did, and they shipped too early.
Do you ever watch speed runs where they deliberately break the game to see how they how come they get through
that's
the
really
fastest? Those are really cool.
Yeah, they try. I've seen runs of game through like Half-Life 2 in minutes, rather than a game normally takes hours to play
walk through walls, and you find out like how that can happen when you start making your own games, and you realize that sometimes collision breaks and you end up walking through a wall. So you can learn a lot from trying to break stuff.
Breaking things is a really good thing when it comes to the industry. So that brings us to our final thoughts for the day. If you want to have more questions, please go and answer it. We'll be around for a couple more minutes answering questions for you. If not, you can check out both of our blogs. I have a blog, tobiahmarks.com, where I write articles that you might find interesting, have different stuff on different game-related topics.
And if you missed us at the end of the day, our Twitters are also at the bottom of the screen. You can tweet at us, and we are pretty respond to you. Yep,
absolutely.
I'd love to talk to people.
If you go to tobiahmarks.com/resources, I have various links, some of that which we talked about today, where you can check out more information.
And I have secondtruth.com, which is my website. It's been my website for a long time. And also, Tap Repeatedly, I write game reviews. Lately, I've been interviewing indie devs about their process. So if you want to learn more about what indie devs are up to, his podcast, that website, you'll learn a lot about local indies, small indies, and big. Yeah,
Be Indie Now, a podcast where I interview game developers so you can hear other people's stories, start to finish, what they did in their development process. So you may find that interesting. It's another show that you can check out.
And thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for joining us. I hope
we are so happy to be able to teach this stuff to people. It's really exciting for me, and this has been really fun. I'm so excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So I hope to see you again soon in a future MBA. Thanks again.